demande. Bon, la journée va se passer en anglais, mais je voulais juste vous dire bonjour, comme ça, avant. So, Sandeep Bakshi and I are very delighted to welcome you to this symposium on decolonial and queer of color archiving, engaging concealed pasts. And we co-organized it specifically as the co-coordinators of the Decolonizing Sexualities Network. For people who don't know the Decolonizing Sexualities Network, you can find out more on the website, which is decolonizingsexualities.org. So we're grateful to the University of Chicago Center in Paris, and in particular to Marie Sahakian, with whom we worked most closely, and we're grateful also to all the co-sponsors of this event, which Sandeep will mention in a minute. We're delighted to open up a space for presentations and conversations with leading scholars on this topic, and with scholars and practitioners who are also working on different kinds of archiving that make this scholarship possible. I want to give a shout out to Roderick Ferguson, whose book One Dimensional Queer interrogates dominant queer historiography, and it puts into relief a range of queer collectives that fight on multiple fronts, namely queerphobia, transphobia, racism, and how it's changing the way that we think about this earlier period. Jin Harithawarn's co-edited book with a collective of queers of color entitled Marvelous Grounds, Queer of Color Histories of Toronto, has led to collective inventions of new kinds of techniques of documentation and analysis. Sam Bourcier's archiving work in France has been instrumental to interrogating dominant historiography and providing alternative critical radical materials that now include archives of sex workers, and we're looking forward to Sam's new book on subaltern archives, which is forthcoming. Evren Savci's path-breaking book, Queer in Translation, Sexual Politics Under Neoliberal Islam, is based on Evren's own construction of a particular kind of unruly archive of queer movements in Turkey, and it also provides a lot of information to think with. There's Malek Sheikh, who oversaw France's first issue on queer and trans of color archives and pasts, which came out this year in the journal FG, and it's part of a whole new generation of very exciting work constructing archives, analyzing archives. Massimisa Garuman's work on silent queer languages in the Maghreb is already generating a vitally important epistemic archive through practices of careful listening. And recently there was an article published by Massimisa on the DSN, Decolonizing Sexualities Network blog. So we hope that you will check it out. In sum, I just want to say that all of our speakers, we're very excited to have all of you here, that you've all made important contributions to the topic of this symposium, and we look forward to hearing everything that you have to say. I want to also honor the presence in the audience, both here, both live and on Zoom, of many people who are also involved in this topic. And for example, Nawal Crawford, Sabrine Al-Rassas, Gerard Koskovic, and especially the collective in Morocco that is actually collecting archives right now, starting an archive there. So thanks everyone for coming, and we thank everybody for being here, and we really look forward to all the presentations, and especially to the conversation that will happen after the presentations. Now Sandeep will say a few words.
Okay, donc moi aussi, je vais commencer en français. Bonjour et bienvenue à cet événement de Decolonizing Sexualities Network, the DSN, comme on le connaît. So we're delighted that concealed queer of color pasts, the archives, the objects, and memory will be at the center of our exchange today. It's a privilege and honor for the DSN that's been in existence for over a decade now to spur, relay, and partake in these conversations, in these discussions. From various constituencies in the archives, the past, our past, have been in construction and conversation with our present and future. may these dialogues today productively occupy spaces in time, going beyond sites of queer, of color, and queerness themselves. This event is made possible by the support, as you know, of the University of Chicago Center in Paris, my research center, l'ARCA Université Paris-Cité, the GWS and the LGBTQ Citizenship Research Cluster, University of California, Berkeley, and our renewed thanks to these centers. Merci aussi à toutes et à tous mes étudiants et étudiants qui sont venus ici. Thank you everyone for being present here, to the audience as well. So let the good times roll.
Okay, so to begin with, the first panel will be chaired by Akila Kizi, who is, and not Salima Amari. Salima had an empêchement, and so Akila has agreed to do it, and we thank you very much for that, and she's from the University of Paris 8. So now we will proceed.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you, Paula. Thank you for everyone to be here. So first panelist is Roderick A. Ferguson. He is the William Robertson Co-Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and American Studies at Yale University. He's the author of One Dimensional Queer in 2020. We demand the university and student protest, University of California in 2017, the reorder of things, university and its pedagogies of minority difference, University of Minnesota in 2012, and aberrations in Black toward a queer of color critic in University of Minnesota in 2004. His talk will be on the anti-racist roots of queer and trans activism, a history of direct action and the body. So feel free to begin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My thanks to Paula and to Sandeep and the other organizers for this invitation. It's also great to be here with my fellow panelists, Evren and Jen. This is a speculative piece that tries to see how productive it might be to put together two genealogies that are typically kept separate. One, the genealogy of an anti-racist movement whose normativity is presumed, and the other, a genealogy of queer and trans liberation whose non-normativity is taken for granted. To confuse matters even more, I'd like to use the body as the linchpin between the two. In particular, I'd like to see how the US context of anti-racism might have provided the grammar for the insurgent body in queer and trans activism in this country. To do so, let me begin in a very unlikely place. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. penned what has been famously entitled Letter from Birmingham Jail. As the story goes, King wrote the letter longhand in response to a statement of concern from 8 religious leaders in that city, Birmingham, Alabama, who chastised King and other civil rights activists for actions that the leaders believed were, quote, unwise and untimely, end quote. The letter rebuts those religious leaders and provides a philosophy of the civil rights struggle. This part you know, but did you know that the letter also has in it a theory of the body and what it can do in social crises as well? Oh yes, it's in the part where King responds to his critics by saying that the behavior that they dubbed unwise and untimely was the result of all other options having been exhausted. About the movement and the demonstrations in Birmingham, King said, quote, then came the opportunity last September, to talk with some of the leaders of the economic community. In these negotiating sessions, certain promises were made by the merchants, such as the promise to remove the humiliating racial signs from the stores. On the basis of these promises, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to call a moratorium on any type of demonstration. As in so many experiences of the past, we were confronted with blasted hopes, and the dark shadow of a deep disappointment settled upon us. So we had no alternative except that of preparing for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community, end quote. According to King, when all else failed, there was the final mechanism, that of direct action and the central place that the body has within its purposes. The body would be the means for clarifying the urgency of a historical moment and making a political argument about that moment. Via the body, direct action in the civil rights struggle would represent a summons for the nation and the world to reckon with a social and historical crisis. The African-American historian Barbara Ransby contextualizes it this way, quote, when the sit-ins of the civil rights movement erupted seemingly spontaneously, involving clusters of young people throughout the Southern United States, they energized and piqued the interests of civil rights activists everywhere, Black and white, young and old. The sit-in was a more dramatic and confrontational tactic than the bus boycott of 5 years before. By doing something instead of withholding participation, young people put their bodies on the line in order to challenge segregation and second-class citizenship. They steadfastly endured hostility and violence. Lit cigarettes were gouged into some protesters' backs, and food was dumped in their laps. Solidarity demonstrations and picket lines sprang up in cities throughout the North, end quote. To appreciate what the body did, we must remember that for the religious leaders who objected to direct action in Birmingham, the use of the body in such public and spectacular displays of resistance was considered extreme and out of hand as the antithesis of rational dialogue. King addressed this explicitly when he said to the religious leaders, quote, you may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth, end quote. Through the body, direct action shattered the silence around racial inequality and exposed that there had been very little dialogue about the ways in which it was promoting suffering, disfranchisement, and death. As a mechanism of direct action, the body said to the ministers, quote, you call for dialogue in a society that has imposed silence, and so we will lay our bodies down to say no more. 4 years later, when King gave his trumpet of conscience speech against the Vietnam War in 1967, he critiqued the political ideology of bourgeois moderation. He said, it is difficult to exaggerate the creative contributions of young Negroes. They took nonviolent resistance, first employed in Montgomery, Alabama, in mass demonstrations, and developed original forms of application, sit-ins, freedom rides, and wade-ins. To accomplish these, they first transformed themselves. Young Negroes had traditionally imitated whites in dress, conduct, and thought in a rigid middle-class pattern. Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish sociologist, described them as exaggerated Americans. Now they ceased imitating and began initiating. Leadership passed into the hands of Negroes, and their white allies began learning from them. This was a revolutionary and wholesome development for both. It is ironic that today, so many educators and sociologists are seeking to instill middle-class values in Negro youth as the ideal in social development. It was precisely when young Negroes threw off their middle-class values that they made an historic social contribution. End quote. For King, bourgeois ideology, whether by the white bourgeoisie or the Black one, was a commitment to the status quo. At the moment that young people en masse rejected it is the moment that they ushered in historic change. This is a searing critique of respectability politics. King is in fact saying that the civil rights movement was a historic repudiation of respectability politics, and that there would have been no movement had that not been the case. Yes, there was sexism and homophobia in the US civil rights movement. We must attend to that. But we must also attend to the fact that as the civil rights movement used the body to challenge the given social order and its constitution through bourgeois ideology, it would encourage other insurgencies as well, even ones that people like King could not dream of. It's safe to say that King probably could not have dreamed of the Stonewall Rebellion. But when the Latinx Stonewall veteran and founder of street transvestite action revolutionaries, Sylvia Rivera, said, quote, all of us were working for so many movements at the time. Everyone was involved with the women's movement, the peace movement, the civil rights movement. We were all radicals. I believe that's what it brought around. You get tired of being just pushed around, end quote. She was in fact invoking the recent history of direct action. In her story, the body figures prominently as well, of course. She says of that night at the Stonewall Inn, quote, at the time, there were many demonstrations. They were fierce demonstrations back then. I don't know how many people remember those times or how many people read of the struggle in this whole country, what was going on. So then the tactical police force came and heads were being bashed left and right. But what I found very impressive that evening was that the more that they beat us, the more we went back for, end quote. Without a doubt, the idea for enlisting the queer and trans body in this context as a catalyst for creative tension was part of the critical world that struggles like the civil rights movement helped to produce. Here, the bodies of trans and queer people, many of whom were people of color, became the catalyst for change. In the 1973 Gay Liberation Day parade, Rivera used her body to contest the formation of a gay bourgeoisie as well. Amidst a hostile crowd of cisgender, lesbian, and gay people, she said, quote, I've been trying to get up here all day for your gay brothers and your gay sisters in jail. They're writing me every motherfucking week and ask for your help, and you all don't do a goddamn thing for them. Have you ever been beaten up and raped in jail? Now think about it. They've been beaten up and raped after they had to spend much of their money in jail to get their self home and try to get their sex change. The women have tried to fight for their sex changes or to become women of the women's liberation. And they write STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, not the women's group. They do not write women. They do not write men. They write STAR because we're trying to do something for them. I have been to jail. I have been raped and beaten many times by men, heterosexual men that do not belong in the homosexual shelter. But do you do anything for them? No, end quote. There were boos and shouts that day, and as the boos and shouts suggested, part of what was objectionable for many in the crowd is what the detractors presumed to be the immodesty and non-normativity of the trans body. In the archival footage of that day, we see Rivera's body in a state of exhaustion and near collapse. Her voice is hoarse and near a breaking point as well. She marshals all these elements to bring the Gay Liberation Day to creative tension. The crowd and the community must be made aware of how they are being overtaken by transphobic exclusions and how bourgeois ideologies of moderation and imitation are driving them. In the words of King, the community was moving toward imitation and away from transformative agency. That's what Sylvia, in her embodied witness and outrage, was saying. The body as a lever for creative tension and confrontation has also been responsible for some of the most important queer art the US has ever seen. Artists such as John Kelly, Richard Elovich, Karen Finley, the dance duo Dance Noise, Bill T. Jones, Robbie McCauley, David Vonarovich, Guerrilla Girl, Grand Fury, and so on, have used the body to bring issues such as HIV/AIDS, heteropatriarchy, racism, as well as corporate and state violence to creative crisis. In doing so, they evinced the ways that direct action activated not only the body for protest, but the body for art making as well. With the anti-racist movements, queer and trans activism, and embodied art practices, we can see perhaps the ways in which the body in direct action helped to conjugate various forms of embodiment. What does it mean to link movements that are seemingly opposed to one another this way? It means that in our haste to read social movements as antagonists, we fail to appreciate the invisible but powerful links between them. We fail to see how a discourse of freedom and insurgency in one setting provides a grammar and a template for liberation in another. In this sense, the insurgent body, as it was conjured in the civil rights movement, became the aqueduct for other bodies. How different this is from our characterization of the identity movements as necessary antagonists and competitors. How more like Audre Lorde's pronouncement that, despite the obvious antagonisms, we must, quote, devise ways to use each other's difference to enrich our visions and our joint struggles. Turning to these histories in this way, through the links that the body in direct action has created, can also be a way of clarifying what politics is. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle defines what it means to be a student and agent of politics. He says, quote, political science is practical and deliberative, for an enactment is a thing that can be done, and the last step in a deliberative process, end quote. In the histories that I've just laid out, the body was part of a deliberation about what could be done to change and improve a social and historical situation. The body was, in other words, a way of delineating and clarifying our enactments. The body was also part of an elaboration of differences, racial differences, gender differences, transgender differences, sexual differences, and so on. In this sense, the body illuminated the ways that politics was becoming a theater of elaboration. In Sylvia Rivera's words, politics is about trying to do something and to be something that the dominant could not imagine. In our day of crisis after crisis, embodied direct action remains the bridge that will give us passage to better worlds. Thank you.
Thank you, Roderick. So the second panelist is Jean Hightower, who was raised on queer of color kitchen tables in London and Berlin. After getting their academic education in Britain, they held positions there and in Finland. 10 years ago, They moved to Toronto, Three Fires territory, where they are now associate professor at York University. Their publications include 2 monographs, Queer Lovers and Hateful Others, Regenerate in Violent Times and Places, The Biopolitics of Mixing, and numerous articles, example in GLQ, Society and Space, Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, Behemoth, and International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and several edited and co-edited special issues, example in Sexualities and International Feminist Journal of Politics, and book collections. Their last few collections, Marvelous Grounds, Between the Lines, Queering Urban Justice, University of Toronto Press, and the marvelousgrounds.com blog, co-edited with the Marvelous Grounds Collective, aim to archive the contributions of queer and trans Black, Indigenous and people of color to social movements in Toronto. Jean has made forerunning contributions to English and German-speaking debates on queer space, gay imperialism, intersectionality, neoliberal cities, police violence, abolition, and trans and queer of color theories. Gina Haritawan will talk about the conjuncture of pandemic and protest, queer of color leaps beyond racial capitalism.
So thank you so much for organizing this event and for inviting us, Paula, Sandeep, Soraya, Sylvia, University of Chicago, the tech people. Thank you for continuing to build these spaces. And Rod, Evelyn, it is good to be in conversation with you again, and I'm excited to hear about your new work. So you asked us to talk about archives. I recently co-edited a book on queer of color counter archives in Toronto, Takoronto, Three Fires territory, that engages with several generations of queer of color activists, artists, and scholars. What I want to focus on today is the other place where I'm still rooted, Berlin, Germany, and the transnational archives of unfinished revolution that are currently reanimated here at the conjuncture of pandemic and global uprising, often by young people of color who, as Rod said, put their bodies in the streets as at a time when staying home was presented as the only valid option. As so often, this conjuncture describes a clash of 2 different kinds of historiographies. The first, an archive of unfinished revolution that actively seeks out ancestors, both blood and chosen, who acted as if everything could change and prepares us for futures that are different from the diversified present. Increasingly, that difference is being defined in positive terms, not just as what we are ready to let go of, but how we want to live and how we can expand those life-making spaces that are already available to us now. I want to argue that queers of color, however sidelined, are currently at the forefront of these prefigurations of what is possible and what is desirable. The second is a colonial archive that for a brief few decades dealt with attacks by social movements on its legitimacy by pedestalizing some of the subjects it was built to trash. I have written about the role of the white queer subject as one such pedestalized object in Queer Lovers and Hateful Others. In addition to decades and centuries of resistance from the outside, cracks in its democratic facades have also resulted from the inside, as blatantly anti-democratic forces are once again becoming the norm in both state and civil society. And I'm sending my solidarity to you in France this week and praying for the less harmful outcome. This resonates with Rod Ferguson's thoughts on the post-truth moment as a reaction to inroads made by feminist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and queer movements. COVID-19 is but the latest stage in this drama of clashing temporalities, which has widened the cracks for more to see. The pandemic has laid bare the necropolitical distinctions between the properly alive and the living dead, to invoke Foucault and Mbembe, between those who are treated as members of high-risk groups or as deserving of home offices, vaccines, ventilators, and ICU beds, and those who are a risk, whose greater morbidity and mortality is acceptable and must be managed so that the economy can go on. Queer of color frameworks are helpful in explaining how this disentitlement from care is produced culturally. According to my recent analysis of German media and political debates of COVID-19, rising numbers nationwide were at key moments in the pandemic explained through the very established tropes of failed genders and sexualities, including and especially cis heterosexualities, that queer of color theorists have long drawn attention to. And I'm thinking, of course, of Rod's work, of Cathy Cohen's work, and of the kinds of racist archives that I've analyzed in my book, Queer Lovers, Hateful Others. From the large amorphous families that congregate during weddings, funerals, or iftars, to protesters who refuse to stay home and disaffected youth who hang out on street corners and pick fights with police, to overcrowded ghettos where whole housing blocks can be put under quarantine if they are portrayed as Roma or Muslim, and where people, once vaccines become available, are labeled vaccine hesitant. In contrast to these degenerate intimacies, whose dysfunctional reproductivity has literally gone viral, the white cis heteropatriarchal family and its nostalgically figured members, the child who suffers from school closure, the lifting of restrictions for Christmas, the grandparent awaiting vaccination in the nursing home, have claimed near exclusive airtime as vulnerable populations in need of protection. In this straitened landscape, minoritarian subjects did not count as worthy of protection. While queer support networks and chosen families were recloseted under the household rules, poor racialized subjects were declared essential workers, sacrificing whom has been acceptable for the sake of the economy. Despite the heightened visibility of the unequal conditions of working and living that render social distancing and other safety measures impossible, the contradictions that produce environmental racism and abandonment remain obfuscated. Again, a queer of color framework that actively converses with theories of racial capitalism is conducive here. In Black Marxism, the book that coined the term, Cedric Robinson defined capitalism as always already racial. As Jody Melamed and Laura Polido have clarified in conversation with Robinson, capitalist accumulation requires racialized distinctions. It requires the prior cultural production of degenerate and devalued populations that can be displaced, dispossessed, incarcerated, put to work, or prematurely killed, depending on capital's current requirements. Well, historically, this occurred through conquest and enslavement. The same logics pervade contemporary regimes of border imperialism, such as the German guest worker regime, resource extraction, urban development, other forms of land grabbing, as well as the prison industrial complex. I want to argue that queer of color theories are helpful in explaining how these exploitable differences are produced through notions of improper and inferior genders and sexualities, from the welfare queen to the black mugger, to the hateful Muslim/Arab/Turkish homophobe, to the criminally infectious rule breaker who is scapegoated for COVID-19. Beyond the important and often devalued work of critique, queer of color methodologies, both organic and academic, help us rehearse ways out of this and other crises. In this, I join other writings by queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color that dedicate themselves to the task of prefiguring alternatives to racial capitalism and settler colonialism. These prefigurations are characterized by a creative engagement with what Jackie Alexander refers to as the palimpsestic counter-archives of the past. They bypass dominant identity debates, hangovers from late 1990s queer, postmodernist, and other theories that, however important in their historical contexts, treat identity as something that is pre-modern, pre-theoretical, and incompatible with change, and whose straw persons suspiciously often wore the face of a Black lesbian. They forge utopian temporalities that are decidedly pro-future, pro-past, and pro-revolution, and refuse an end of history. Much of this work of dreaming, of marveling, takes place in science fiction and other creative genres. As mentioned earlier, I recently co-edited 2 anthologies on queer of color spaces and histories in Toronto as part of a research team that we called Marvelous Grounds, in commemoration of the Afro-Surrealism of Suzanne Césaire. Césaire, whose work has been summarized in English by Robin Kelly, argued that we need art in order to prepare us for the marvelous. The same leap into a better future was invoked by Black lesbians in 1977 in the famous Combahee River Collective Statement, who actively embraced a revolutionary left-wing politic while also distancing themselves from the racism and cis-heterosexism of the white left establishment. I argue that we have been witnessing rehearsals of such a leap in pandemic Germany. These rehearsals are happening across multiple sites and through multiple methods, from the creation of mutual aid networks to the subversion of the official household rules, which effectively recriminalize queer support networks and other intimacies that do not conform to the white cis-heteronormative nuclear family, to the formation of pods, bubbles, and care collectives where queers in particular have kept each other safe and alive, to the organizing of anti-racist protests that reclaim public space from the conservative hygiene of the official corona rules and redefine the question of collective safety from the bottom up. This occurs against the backdrop of a growing public awareness that the police will not keep us safe, which in Germany is the product of decades of anti-racist work locally. A well-known example is the campaign for Uri Jallo, an African asylum seeker whose death in police custody, just like the killing spree of the National Socialist Underground, was actively covered up by the authorities. The same happened in Hanau, site of the latest racist mass murder, where police, though called, did not respond. The pandemic nearly erased the public memory of the 9 lives taken on 19th February 2020, just before the first lockdown. Sagt ihre Namen: Gökhan Gültekin, Sedat Gürbüz, Said Nessar Hashemi, Mercedes Kirpach, Hamza Kurtovic, Willi Viorel Paun, Fatih Saracoglu, Ferhat Unvar, Kaloyan Velkov. Hanau gave rise to new political spaces, including the family-run Initiative 19. Februar and Migrantifa, a new mass movement by and for migrant youth. Migrantifa organized in several German-speaking cities to commemorate victims of racist violence and build community in various ways, from protests to education events to food justice and other mutual aid in racialized neighborhoods. Their call for the one-year Hanau protest sums up the relationship between state and civilian racism as follows, quote, "All these acts of racist killings are effects of a system where the state, intelligence, police, courts, politicians, protect and support fascist networks, are a part of them even. Racism and right-wing extermination ideologies are neither the problem of a handful nor marginal event." This resistance dovetailed with the biggest mobilizations against racism historically. In Germany, in June 2020 alone, tens of thousands joined Black Lives Matter protests. Happening during the pandemic, these protests were demonized by politicians and journalists as super spreader events that put society at risk. However, I argue that there have been key sites of transformation, giving rise to new strategies for safety outside of the system. My concept of transforming safety is itself part of an archive inspired by earlier theories of abolition and transformative justice that prefigure safety outside of the criminal justice system. Some of the folks whose archival footprints I'm in include Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Ajaris Dixon, Leah Lakshmi Pipshna Samara Sinha, and in Germany, our dear colleagues Vanessa Thompson, Nadia Samur, and Melanie Brizel. In a complicated way, the transformation of safety that I'm describing also vibes with Anthony Giddens' concession, however tokenistic, to the role of gay AIDS activists, who brought about a transformation of intimacy, as he called it, that wider straight society benefited from as well. I argue that something similar is going on during this pandemic, that we are in the middle of another round of transformation that is once more led by marginalized folks. In early 2021, towards the end of the second wave, I conducted 20 qualitative, semi-structured interviews with activists in Berlin who are involved in spaces that are variously self-organized as queer, transgender, migrant, Black, or people of color spaces. Interviewees brought strong critiques of racial profiling, which, while far from new, has gained force and legitimacy during COVID-19. Mona El Omari, a counselor, care worker, and systemic advisor with prisoners, described racial profiling during COVID as an outflow of older policing practices that have been intensified by a new cultural context of corona racism. And I quote, "In summer 2020, it became clear who's being policed. Anecdotally, here in Berlin, the police have had a much higher presence in Kreuzberg and Neukölln than in Friedrichshain, where the Volkspark was swarming, yet policing was much more polite and discreet. COVID has put existing relations on steroids. All the media reports blaming COVID on Turkish weddings, Ramadan, and parties in Roma families, and then they put whole housing blocks under quarantine. And now they're all going skiing again in Tyrol, which was the first COVID hotspot in Europe. And yet for months they were talking about the so-called China virus. All the problems to do with policing have become intensified, and they've created new crimes too, like loitering. If a group of Black or POC kids chill in the street, they'll be profiled rather than white hipsters, so that a group of non-white people is now even more suspicious. Given the aversion to racialized folks occupying public space, it is no surprise that the protests that took place in 2020 were heavily policed too. Many interviewees called out the contradictions in cancelling the demo 6 months after Hanau due to rising numbers. Meanwhile, Querdenkers, the German variation of the COVID deniers, have regularly gathered thousands, sometimes weekly, under such mottos as masks off, and were generally tolerated by local governments and cheered on by the police, despite their openly anti-state stance. Yet the superspreader label was stuck instead on the anti-racist protests. I want to argue that rather than a threat, the protests happening during the pandemic have been key sites of prefiguring care and safety. They are spaces where people of color, after a long history of patronage, are not only critiquing the ways in which the state does not make us safe, but taking the task of rebuilding safer relationships back into their own hands. And I want to give just 2 brief examples to illustrate this transformation of safety. The first is the safety protocol for protests by Black Lives Matter Berlin. Here, COVID safety not only includes wearing masks and keeping distance, it also includes racial profiling, electronic surveillance, tear gas attacks. From May 2020 to July 2021, BLMB discontinued demonstrations and other in-person events following medical advice, notably for the protection of Black people. The other example is the safety protocol of the protest 1 year after Hanau. Mariam, a self-chosen pseudonym who introduced herself as queer, 25, a student, described the ethics of this protest in the terms of disability justice. A basic understanding of safety and access. I do this so that you can be here too. The ground rules at the protest that she went on to describe, including physical distancing and wearing masks, at first sight resembled the corona rules of the state. At the same time, the values, intentions, and horizons they reflected were in direct tension with the state. Hamza, another self-chosen pseudonym, who identified as Kurdish, Muslim, and non-binary/trans, described this as follows, and this is the quote on the PowerPoint. Everyone at the rally had to wear a mask. That was definitely a requirement. But as organizers, we also brought extra masks to distribute to people who wanted to join the demo. For example, we had a situation where one person, whom I also didn't read as white, was walking up to our rally and found it really cool, but didn't have a mask. So we weren't going to say, we're going to exclude people who don't carry masks but want to be a part of this. We paid attention to such things. In contrast to the official rules, the call to wear masks at the rally is not grounded in isolation or punishment. The organizers are well aware that an unmasked demonstration, in contrast to the Querdenkers demonstrating the same day, would put themselves and others at risk, not just of COVID, but also of police violence. Safety here emerges as a multi-layered and socially constructed concept, where the risk is not just the virus, but also those who claim to protect from it. This does not render safety any less real. There are clear rules. At the demo, we learn that masks are required so that many can come and no one will get arrested. However, these rules are consensual rather than punitive, expansive rather than exclusionary. They are based on the awareness that safety both requires and creates radical access, and an abolitionist care that is grounded in redistribution, transformative education, and interdependent collectivity. To conclude, in this paper, I have engaged in a queer of color conversation with theories of racial capitalism and with activists on the ground in order to explain the uneven distribution of chances of life and death during COVID-19. Going beyond the level of critique, I have argued that at the conjuncture of pandemic and protest, relationships are being rehearsed that directly challenge the state's power to define what makes us safe and teach new ways of being together and in the streets in the presence of a virus that is here to stay. I have revisited these theories of racial capitalism not just as diagnostics, but as roadmaps to complete unfinished revolutions and prefigure alternatives to the murderous present. Queer of color worldings, with their readiness to embody the impossible, to desire the unrealistic, and to dream big and small spaces, from the kitchen table to the street, have a particular role to play in these transformations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean, for your presentation. So the last panelist is Evren Savsi. I hope I'm not, I just pronounce a good way your name. Is it okay? Evren Savsi. Okay. So Evren Savsi is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Yale University. Her first book, Queer in Translation, Sexual Politics and the Neoliberal Liberal Islam, in 2021, analyzes sexual politics under contemporary Turkey's AKP regime with an eye to the travel and translation of sexual politic vocabulary. Her second book, Project, turns to the politic economy of monogamy. Savsi's work on the intersections of language, knowledge, sexual politics, neoliberalism, and religion appeared in Journal of Marriage and the Family, Ethnography, Sexualities, Political Power and Social Theory, Theory and Event, Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, and GLQ. Her talk will be on archives of the present. So you can start.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here with all of you today. Before I start, I want to quickly thank Paula and Sandeep for inviting me to join the symposium today, and everyone else involved in the organization for the opportunity to be in conversation with all of you. I'm also really delighted to be on the same panel with Rod and Jin and excited to think together during the Q&A. Those of us trained in the social sciences in the United States rarely encounter the term archive during our studies, unless we take courses outside of our departments, ideally in the humanities. So, unsurprisingly, it was in a queer studies course offered in the English department of my doctoral institution when I first encountered the term archive. We spent 1 week reading chapters from Derrida's Archive Fever and Svetkovich's An Archive of Feelings, and discussing how archives are made, what constitutes an archive, what does and does not go into an archive, and who gets to make such decisions. Soon after coursework was over, some of my friends in the humanities also started referring to the things they studied as their archive. I too was asked on occasion what my archive was. This turned out to be something one should be able to mention in a cover letter, an interview, or a job talk, for instance. In fact, in my field, sociology, as well as other social sciences, we are often expected to refer to our archives as data, which personally has always been troubling to me since I never understood what I did as science. Ethnography and interviews were not data to me, but they did not seem to make an appropriate archive either. Even as humanities scholars were not quite willing to put boundaries around what constitutes an archive, and in fact sought to problematize this very gesture of power, there seemed to be an unspoken rule that archives did not belong in social sciences. A quick piece of information / reminder for our audience that in the United States, history holds a very ambiguous relationship to social science and humanities as a field. When I first started doing field work for my book, Queer in Translation, I knew I was going to follow queer activism in Turkey to try to understand how sexual politics worked, what activists prioritized, what they thought mattered and didn't, their relationships with the state, the local governments, and with private business. I was curious to see how they envisioned sexual liberation, to use a loaded term for a second, and how they organized to that end. I was not wedded to limit my research to one site or one activist group. I had some questions, but not quite the research question yet, so I thought it best to follow everything as much as possible. I used the somewhat unscientific tool called the instinct. When I heard certain news stories, certain conversations, or certain events that seemed significant to me in ways that I would only be able to explain later on, I made sure to follow them. In other words, I didn't have a clear sense of what should and should not belong to the archive I was creating. The chapters and their archives became evident only towards the end of the first research period and during writing. Not only does each chapter have a separate archive, the archives also do not quite match up methodologically. One of my chapters, for instance, is almost exclusively based on conversations that took place in mainstream media, TV shows and media interviews and newspaper columns. And I received, and I accept rightful criticism for this because I claim the book to be ethnographic. But sometimes debates only unfold in the media, and the actual material bodies involved in those debates rarely find themselves in the same room, if ever. So this made me question and keeps me questioning whether our methods define our archives, and if so, what belongs and does not belong to an ethnographic archive. If I had a strict understanding of ethnography and imagined that I was not authorized to write about events unless I was able to be a physical participant observer to them, I would have never bothered to follow the story that forms my first chapter. This doesn't simply mean that an entire chapter would be missing from the book, which also would be the case, but much more importantly, that I would not have sought to understand events that have significantly formed my understanding of the changing political landscape in Turkey, and therefore would have ended with a much less adequate analysis as a whole. What I did not understand at the time, and has only later become apparent to me, is the fact that through my research, I was making an archive of the present. In the past year, I have encountered so my book came out the beginning of 2021, about a year ago. In the past year, I have encountered younger queer activists who have told me that reading the book gives them access to the political and activist landscape back in 2000s. While I must admit that the thought of the recent past, which is less than 15 years ago, being so inaccessible to the current generation is a little scary, I'm happy that the book works, among other things, as the social memory of a strange time of much social upheaval and change. But ethnographies as archives of the present do a little more than providing a history for the future. So I would like to spend the remainder of my time to reflect on the following question. If at the time of collection, an ethnographer collects a living archive, what do such living archives do? Where might their significance and power lie? Living archives, perhaps most importantly, are able to capture contradictions and disjunctures in the social and political field in the moment. This is important because liberal historicizing usually covers over such contradictions and tells flat stories of things getting better, or in the case of Turkey, usually stories of things getting worse. I believe in the revolutionary capacity that inheres in contradictions in the social, economic, cultural, and political fields. The pushback against narratives such as "it gets better" have their root in the important and necessary recognition that it only gets better for some queers and genderqueer and trans people. But analysis cannot stop pointing out that fact. It needs to go further and seek to understand how a system can make life so great for some and so unlivable for others, while it tells the story that things are getting better for everyone. How are better and perhaps more importantly, life defined according to this logic? Contradictions are key to exposing the ideological structure of systems of oppression and exploitation, and part of our work needs to be better understanding why some of these ideologies are so convincing to so many and so persistent as a result. Sometimes contradictions are apparent in the moment as one creates an archive of the present, and sometimes they reveal themselves when we look at a social field long enough. In that sense, a living archive of the present can also provide us with an account of social change, of the emergent. Because I had the chance to follow the unfolding events and the changing political landscape for 8 years for the research of queer and translation, many stories became stories of change and disintegration, and at times unfortunate ones. For instance, in the chapter where I discuss how the debates on the right to wear the headscarf to public universities and offices became contentious when secularists started questioning headscarf activists regarding whether they also supported LGBT rights, I trace the shifting position of some headscarf activists and of queer activists and the ultimate foreclosing of solidarities that seemed possible and even emergent at some point. What is interesting in that story that I will highlight in this short time is that liberal imaginary shows up in the story as both a partial enabler and a partial dissolver of solidarities. I don't mean hereby to assign an explanatory omnipotence to liberalism. In fact, the core of my epistemic position in the book is that meanings are made and transmitted in ways that are too complex to be captured by any omnipotent explanatory category, including the category of discourse. I argue that language and meanings are complex, contradictory, and contextual, and that subjects can be improperly hailed or misinterpreted. What I rather mean is that most people do not take the tenets of liberalism at face value, and liberal categories themselves might transform in the moment of translation. Even as scholars can forget that liberal and illiberal are simply analytic categories and that we have invented and become invested in their separability, in life they're often intertwined and are experienced in coexistence. This is important, I argue, when thinking about an archive of the present, because if we use it as a collection of contradictory and disjunctive meanings and practices, it will also allow us to resist the ideological absolutes that can seem tempting when we encounter social formations. I have found in the stories I have followed and documented that making room for such contradictory and complex meanings also allows for better listening practices and potential solidarities and communing among those who seek social change. For instance, the initial height of solidarities among those who felt like the others of the Turkish state that I just mentioned was in the aftermath of the assassination of the Armenian journalist Hrant Dink and the subsequent formation of the January 19th platform that brought together headscarf activists, feminists, queer activists, and ethnic and religious minority activists. The moment of 10,000 people marching at Hrant Dink's funeral with banners that read, "We are all Hrants, we are all Armenian," might seem like the product of a liberal imagination, and in some ways it is. It is also at the very same time a moment, though, that contradicts with liberalism because it springs from the very recognition of the limits of rights, limits of juridical justice, and the fact of racist state violence. If this was the moment of emergence of solidarities, the moment of dissolution of these solidarities was also strongly intertwined with the logic of liberalism. For instance, during a TV show that I analyzed, where the right to wear the headscarf was discussed with 4 college students, even as the right to wear the headscarf to public universities was framed in liberal and abstract terms, partially, and the ban understood as a breach of women's right to education, when the question of supporting LGBT rights was brought up, the limits of abstraction were obvious. The veiled guests at the show shared that they didn't know much about the restrictions on LGBT students. Were they not allowed to university campuses because they were gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans? The answer to this question, of course, and this is at the moment where they themselves were not allowed to university campuses wearing their headscarves. The answer to this question, of course, pries open the limits of a liberal understanding of justice, of abstract equivalence of different rights, and of normative violence versus legal violence. The violence headscarf activists had experienced was not simply legal violence either. Stories of excessive police violence at campus entrances, or the violence of so-called persuasion rooms, where secularist faculty would try to convince students to take off their headscarves, are pervasive. The use of human rights, women's rights, and LGBT rights were employed alongside of arguments that undid their very liberal logic. If one were to try to understand the Muslim headscarf activists or the queer activists in terms of the analytical categories of traditional modern, liberal illiberal, global local, or colonial indigenous, we would lose the complexity of their social and political existence. In fact, that was precisely the framing that led to the falling out of these activists. The two groups found themselves in solidarity again during Gezi Park uprisings of 2013, and later during the Boğaziçi University resistance that started early in 2021, when they were able to push back against ideological formations that would try to map the headscarf issue versus the LGBT issues onto archaic tradition modernity binaries on one hand, and onto moral, immoral, or good citizen versus terrorist subjects binaries of the government on the other. It was the liberation of one's social and political existence from these frames that allowed people to see their common plights and the commonalities of their visions for a better future. I propose that living archives hold the potential to continually remind us that one cannot overdetermine how any concept or frame of thought will travel and find life wherever it arrives. They also will remind us that both social formations are complex, contradictory, and messy, and that this is precisely what makes them alive and interesting. These reminders are useful for a progressive political imaginary because critique that forgets that our categories of analysis never fully capture lived reality are inadequate for imagining how solidarities might be forged out of these very contradictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Merci beaucoup, Akila. Je ne vais pas pouvoir faire justice, j'allais dire. So I think it's better if I speak in English. So I can't possibly do justice to these 3 extraordinary interventions. So I noted down some points that we can discuss during the Q&A. So by way of summing up, I'd like to observe that these 3 rich talks make us reflect, in fact, force us to reflect upon, as Rod Ferguson suggests, 2 genealogies that are kept separate. Without reason, anti-racist critiques and queer and trans liberation. Jin Ritter-Warren's presentation also discusses these 2 historiographies, especially in relation to Racial Capitalism by Cedric Robinson, and utilizes the histories of queer and trans mobilization and anti-racist organization as a point of departure to refer us to apparatuses of oppression and injustice, but most importantly, to refer us to the possibilities of collective care and possibilities of collective action that were revealed in our pandemic times, concurrently pointing to the future of collective care. I adore the word possibility because I'm also thinking of Aimé Césaire's use of the word possibility, of the possibilities that were never meant to be. And Evren Safsi's intervention extends the theorization of queer mobilization in the field of archives and archiving practices, especially what she terms living archives, that confounds what are present or past are or are deemed to be. Akin to what Ferguson and Harita once signaled to, that is archival historiographies. That's all I have to say about this panel. Thank you so much for this panel. I think we'll take questions. Paolo, would you come and regulate the questions? So if the audience would like to ask questions, please over here, or if we have questions in the chat, we'll regulate them.
Are there any questions from the audience, please?
So just because we just talked about archives, I wanted to see how, Roderick Ferguson, how did you find your archives? I assume that the MLK letters were published, but did you take the unedited, and especially during COVID? And for Sylvia Rivera speech, how did you manage to find those?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much for that question. You know, the letter from the Birmingham jail is, I mean, it's just circulated everywhere. Now, I think there's an observation there that even though the archival documents may be readily accessible, it doesn't mean that they're actively engaged, you know, which I think is also a kind of interesting fact. Like, we tend to imagine archives as abundant, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the archives are mined, you know. So it was only, I've been reading the letter from the Birmingham jail for years. It was only when I was teaching my queer and trans liberation undergraduate course here that I started to notice the implicit argument and discourse about the body, right? So I think it's significant that here was a text that I've lived with for so long, but didn't see, you know, what for me now is a core element of that argument and the ways in which it, you know, connects to latter-day movements, you know, among queer and trans folks. In terms of the Silva Rivera archive, years ago, a colleague gave me a PDF of, you know, just the online, you know, kind of, you know, sort of alternative press that published Silva Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson's speeches, interviews, and it's by the writer Ain't Nothing, E-H-N first name, and then Nothing last name. And so if that colleague had not introduced me to that archive, I would not have known. I mean, it's not like the star papers from that particular compilation, you know, are published by the major presses, you know? And so there's also another interesting observation about archives, the way in which activists and minor presses are producing them as open source documents. And I think that should be a kind of model for all of us in this moment.
My question is to everyone, do you hear me? I can talk, maybe, do you hear me very well or not very well?
I think I hear you well enough, yeah.
So I can talk loud so that everybody can hear also.
Thank you.
My question is, related to living archives and also challenges that those archives perceive. I would like you to elaborate on the dichotomy that has been established also by the state. I mean, Minister of Interior Affairs, for example, in Turkey, especially during university demonstrations, pointing out some LGBT artworks, saying that, you know, those are immoral and not acceptable by the religion, etc. So there is also the creation of dichotomy that living archives, I think, are trying to overcome it, but I think this also adds to social formation that you mentioned, and I would like you to elaborate on that a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. So maybe for very briefly for the audience members who might not have heard about this incident, the Boğaziçi University sort of resistance started allegedly with a queer art installation on campus, but it was part of a larger resistance to the appointed rector, which is a kind of appointed university president, which was appointed and not elected for the first time. So most of the campus, including faculty, including students, were protesting that. And then it seemed that this queer art show, especially one piece in it that combines elements of Islam and elements of queerness and transness and non-binary like flags together, like it became almost a scapegoat through which to then flood the campus with police force, shut down the LGBTQ plus club, but also some other affiliated formations. So in that moment, what was really powerful was that that campus and the student activists of the time and of the past could not be slotted into these binary categories that I was trying to problematize. I mean, in this short talk, I could do only so much, but what I was trying to say was that dismissing certain formations as liberal or illiberal, as traditional, like putting them into these binaries will not work and will foreclose solidarity. So what was happening in that moment was, as the government tried to position the queer activists and anyone who supported them as immoral, a lot of like obviously pious university students came across to support them. And when people said, "You're supporting these immoral queer activists today, where were you when students with headscarves were not let onto campus, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago?" They could show footage that the same people were there at those protests. So they're like, we are against that ban and we're against this ban. Like, we are going to protect all of our students, like the pious Muslim students and the queer students and the feminist students and everyone. So I think in that sense, the complexity there was like so able to push back against, I mean, for people who are willing to listen and hear, obviously there will be people we won't be able to ever convince of this, and they will hold on to the government's arguments around who is immoral, who is, caring. They also found some documents of, if I remember correctly, at the LGBTQ club, they found the handbook or some sort of like a program of a Kurdish organizations gathering, and then terrorism immediately came into the discourse, like, and supporting terrorist activities. But I think that I mean, it's hard to say something is successful or something has failed, but I think in terms of pushing back, because the club was closed down, the appointed president is still there. A lot of the teachers they have expelled, right? So it's hard to say that resistance has succeeded at everything it wanted. But I think in terms of pushing back against a very simple ideological discourse, I think it did a pretty good job. And I don't know if this answers your question well enough. I mean, if you were asking, I don't know if, I don't want to take too much time, but there is something about the use of the very documents at the LGBTQ Center that also says that sometimes archives turn us in, right? Like sometimes they can be used, like the things we gather can be used against us. And that has happened a lot in Turkey as well. But I think it also does the work of exposing the ideological structure at play. So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Accessibility first. Jean, do you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to come back to our discussion of that Sylvia Rivera speech, "You all better quiet down," because it teaches us something about both the archive, how we imagine, obviously, LGBT history, and the erasures that are happening from LGBT archives, but also the stakes of archiving themselves. So Reina Gossett is an archivist. She's a lot of other things as well. She's a Black trans woman. She's a prison abolitionist. She's a filmmaker. She made a film about Marsha P. Johnson, who is often kind of remembered as Sylvia Rivera's kind of fellow Stonewall veteran. The film got stolen by David France, right, who is this white cis gay filmmaker, and who stole a lot of the archival information for his Netflix documentary, The Life and Death of Marsha P. Johnson, that of course millions have watched since. Tourmalines, which is the artist name of Reina Gossett's own film on Marsha P., remained a very kind of small, again, speculative work of art that creatively engages with Marsha's life in this way that echoes, what I shared earlier about the marvelous, what Rod said about speculation as well. Because often we don't have access, right? We don't have access to the ancestors and elders that we need. So now I'm no longer young, but when I was a young queer person of color, I craved ancestors, I craved elders, but I couldn't find them, right? And when I could, they were curated for me in these very patronizing ways in the archives that I had access to. Now, Reina Gossett is someone who, and I'd love for Rod to maybe talk more about the role of her work in your work as well, who has done that work for us, who has gone into these sterile, often securitized, often police spaces, and put her body there as an archivist in order to make histories accessible to us that otherwise would not be. And that film that went viral, where Sylvia Rivera intervenes in that, first kind of respectable Christopher Street Day precursor, and tells everyone off after, police try to remove her, and transphobic lesbian feminists assaulted her, and the kind of cis gay men assaulted her because after fighting for the movement, she was no longer, desirable, right? Once the movement becomes respectable. So that speech in itself, it took people, it represents a lot of labor, finding that speech. Tourmaline actually talks about how she went into, I think it was the Lesbian Her Story archives, which of course are a very beautiful space for a lot of people, but at the same time, again, represent the very violences that we discuss here, right? Especially against trans women of color, who are always the first to kind of make history and the first to be erased from it. So she actually went there and found it and then kind of put it online, and then Vimeo took it off after threats that the copyright of this kind of very of the folks who owned the copyright happened to be transphobic lesbian feminists, right? So they were like, this is actually our work, you cannot put it online. And if you want to kind of follow that history, you can, of that history of that archive that was made for us, that then disappeared, that was then appropriated in so many different ways. You can kind of Google, right? So I just spontaneously Googled Sylvia Rivera, "You all better quiet down," Lesbian Her Story archives. But Tourmaline herself has written about what happened to her, the kind of how she would go into these archives and be pulled out, as the visible trans Black body. So yeah, I would love for Rod to maybe talk more about the significance of her work in your work as well, and yeah, and maybe yeah, your engagement with trans women of color.
Sure. So I think that one of the work that Tourmaline has done has been tremendous, in terms of, an archivist who, both unearths, subjugated content, but also talks about the rigors of that unearthing. And so what we get, as you're pointing to, is the kind of political economy of the archive at the present moment, that it's not an easy access, that it's not a story of easy access. It is a story in which, the archive is still very much policed and regulated, Tourmaline's story, right? And so it's an important reminder that the same or similar sort of iterations of power and knowledge that suppressed the archive, for, say, Starr, and for Marsha P. Johnson, decades ago, are also operating in this moment, right? And so, I think that Tourmaline's work should be an inspiration to all of us, and also a model, for all of us as well. It also brings me to the question that I wanted to ask you, Jen, is to talk more about the relationship between ancestors and the archive. I've been doing a bit of work around what does it mean to think of, the ancestors as still operating within the archives that we engage, but also the institutions in which we work. And so I wanted to hear you say more about the relationship between ancestors and archives, because it also then begs the question of the metaphysics of the archive as well. Does that make sense?
Wow, yeah, I would actually love to kind of pose the question back at you. I just had had a shower going down my back. Yeah, obviously I'm indebted to Jackie Alexander in as well as to a lot of my contemporaries in Toronto, including like activists on the ground who do not necessarily publish, but do a lot of artwork that also involves spirituality, right? And and like I said earlier, my relationship to the archive got clarified when I, also in response to Evren's, thought on what is the archive. When I moved to Toronto, as a place that is very complicated, and it hosts the world's biggest LGBT archive, so it kind of, they pride themselves in that. It is also a place where the social movements cannot afford to think of themselves, and often do not think of themselves as antagonistic. I loved how you put that earlier, because it is just so clear, the leadership of QT BIPOC in Toronto is just so kind of, you can't ignore it. It's just there, it's the same people at the different protests. It's the same people who have been around and, held space. And at the same time, the very erasures that we've been writing and talking and protesting about in Europe happen there as well, right? So even when it's undeniable, even when there are a lot of elders, walking around that everyone knows, this kind of notion of like the queer of color subject being unusual, being new, being exceptional, being the first, the first ever, which is like our invitation into the archive is, you have to present yourself as the first. All these things were happening there as well. Another thing that really kind of struck me was how people engaged with ancestors, and, how ancestors are called upon, sometimes literally, right? Because spirituality is often, how events begin, like through smudging, through prayer, through libations, and very definitely in their creativity and in their writing as well, right? Because, yeah, I mean, we need, we need ancestors in order to, to get through this moment or any moments. like I think a lot of us are realizing we just cannot do it on our own, right? And that this fiction that neoliberalism imposes on us, of being individuals, that the academy especially imposes on us, right? Of being these kind of brilliant individuals, the first, the last, the only, just do not work, right? So how about yourself? But or maybe I don't know if there's space.
I mean, I would answer, but I feel like I should yield to Sandeep,
Makes sense.
and maybe the audience. Sandeep, can I answer? Should I?
Yes, please, Rod, go ahead.
Okay, no, so I was just going to say to, in response to Jen, that I think that's absolutely right. It occurs to me that part of what we are doing, with, the queer archive, the queer of color archive, the trans archive, trans of color archive, is that, it is, a kind of engagement with, ancestral work at this point. I remember when I, back in 2008, gave a talk at Oberlin College, and I decided for that particular group, I would talk about Isaac Julian's Looking for Langston. So I gave a lecture on Looking for Langston, and then afterwards, some of the students came up to me, and these were the sort of, righteous, politically active, queer of color, white queer students. And I said, I apologize to them. I said, I'm so sorry. You've probably gotten so much of this film, Looking for Langston, in your courses, and here you have to sit through another lecture on it. And then they said to me, we've never heard of this film, right? And it was at that moment that I realized, if we don't do this work, it won't get done. The sort of, really the ancestral work that the products, the cultural forms that are left there and often dormant, that, we have to activate them. And we can't take for granted that they have been activated for our students. And so if we don't engage the ancestors, then there are all types of genealogies that will be lost. But that's just a quick answer.
Thank you. I think we've got someone called Carmen Rial, who's asking a question for, I would like you to talk about the accessibility of files of archives.
Maybe I'll say something very quick that I didn't mention. I think that there is maybe the current moment where, of the worldwide net and social media and everything, I think can create the illusion that so much more is accessible. And I want to caution us against that, because so many things I have used during my research, first of all, a number of the newspapers I used were shut down, literally, so their websites were gone. A number of, and these were all online. I had luckily downloaded lots of things or had printed them out. One of the journalists I write about at length changed her entire political position and made her old, more complex and critical of the government writings inaccessible, so they're nowhere to be found. And I found it really interesting that it seems like, oh, I'll just type this website and everything will appear. I don't have to, right? We don't like the archival work that we do with things that seem obviously not so accessible, right? You have to go to an archive. These films are not always very well preserved, or these documents, we know that they're rare and difficult to access. But I also think that a lot can get erased very, very easily with digital collections, and can disappear from sight. And this was one of the kind of lessons learned from me. And And it is interesting that some things literally stop existing the moment they're taken down or taken offline. And someone who looks at this person's writing today will think that she had a linear kind of political position for the last 10, 15 years, which is absolutely not the case, but you cannot find so easily the previous writings. So it's just a quick thing that came to my mind.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your talks. This question is for Jin. You offer this structural transnational critique through your concept of racial capitalism, rooted in more localized or place-based examples of specific struggles in the US and Berlin, for example. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the relationship between the structural critique you're making on the one hand and the more place-based struggles you offer as support for your structural critique on the other hand, towards roadmaps to unfinished revolutions, as you say so compellingly. I work on similar structural critiques, and I find this approach fundamental to today's ongoing global crisis. So I was wondering if you also had any suggestions on producing these types of critiques today, while also really steering clear of old patterns of universalist thinking. In doing so, which I live in France and have found is an ongoing problem in academic literature here. Thank you so much to all of you again.
Could you tell me who you are? Sorry.
Who are you?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm a researcher. Oh, hi. Thanks again. I'm a researcher and a writer, and I'm currently trying to finish my dissertation at UC Berkeley. But I live in France. It's complicated. My name, and I have a name. My name is Julie Gorecki. Thank you.
Hi, Julie.
Thank you for this question. Yeah, it's of course an important one, and yeah, so thank you. I will keep thinking about it. But one thing to bear in mind is that place-based anything is also not outside of the transnational and the global. So, for example, looking at Berlin, where, you know, I mean, if you look at the housing situation, you know, that has quickly gone from a renter city to, you know, one of the key sites of finance capitalist investment, you know, which has had huge effects on both queer of color and anti-racist organizing, obviously. So when I did field work for Queer Lovers and Hateful Others, which was in the 2000s, everyone lived in the same districts, right? So that is no longer the case. People are, you know, scattered all across the city, which then has, you know, because they can't afford to live there anymore, which then has implications on how you organize, you know. So the site I was looking at was very place-based. It was kitchen tables in Berlin, right? So that is no longer the kind of key site of organizing for different reasons, you know. One is that people simply do not, and I just reread Paula Baqueta's Didactics chapter, right, where you write about your housing project and kind of engaging with your neighbors and the very kind of rooted relationships that grew out of that, both for spontaneous mutual aid and conviviality, but also for kind of structural solidarity and kind of opposing slumlords and such, and fighting against racial profiling and being part of all these different struggles. So so that really reminded me of, you know, of the kind of 2000s Berlin, even though it is a very different place and decade, right? But yeah, so you don't really have those kind of structures where people just kind of bump into each other and then spontaneously do something together anymore. At the same time, you know, things have also moved on from that kind of tiny site, and we now have the QT BIPOC festival, you know, that happens once a year. During the pandemic, it happened digitally. So I just saw Nandi in the audience, one of the organizers. Thank you so much for your work there. So yeah, my work, as you know, is very place-based, and at the same time, obviously things travel, and capitalism is one, you know, one kind of great example of something awful that has traveled rapidly everywhere. So I guess applying the concept of racial capitalism to a European concept is not unproblematic, but at the same time, it is also important because, and I see Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez in the chat as well, who has done work on racism and capitalism in Germany, and is also kind of located in Frankfurt, you know, where the kind of, you know, the history of kind of critical the Frankfurt School is. So I'm just thinking, kind of associating that place with a particular, and obviously like Enka being there is so amazing because that place is now associated with a particular kind of very white genealogy of thinking about capitalism as something that has very little to do with racism. And when you begin to talk about racial capitalism, in this kind of German and European context, what people often associate with it is, you mean a stage of capitalism that is now racial, you know? And I think Robinson is helpful here because he insists that capitalism was always already racial. Right? That's how it made it, you know? That's how it made it into work. So thank you for this question.
Hi everyone. I hope I'll make myself understandable because English is not my native language. I would like to thank the Decolonizing Sexualities Network for inviting us with Massinissa. So our communication with Massinissa Garaoun is about our practices because we're both involved in practices that are supposed to keep traces from queer people of color struggles, queer and trans people of color struggles, discussions and languages. So we were both frustrated because we were not satisfied by the androcentric nature of the discussions on homosexuality, gender, and sexuality issues in North Africa, and this tendency to generalize scientific conclusions made about very specific conditions to this very heterogeneous area. We are also both working on a book project about sexuality and gender minorities in North Africa, but instead of talking about this particular project, we wanted to share our experiences when it comes to constructing our archive, because the challenges we've been facing might raise interesting questions about queer and trans people of color archive. So first I'll talk about Assiégé, about my own experience as the editor-in-chief of the journal Assiégé, which is produced by, as Johan said, women, trans, queer people of color coming from the French Empire. And then Massinissa will address his own experience of archiving gender and sexual minority languages in North Africa. Assiégé is a journal which was created in 2015 at a moment of vivid tensions within anti-racism in France. At the time, Assiégé's creators were arguing for the articulation of social relations of race, class, gender, and sexuality. And I kind of joined the project in 2018, and now we've been thinking more and more about our journal as an archive, or at least the possibility to keep traces from our struggles. Indeed, Assiégé is available for free in a digital format, but it is also printed by our editors, Syllabs Editions. So to think about Assiégé as a living archive or a lively archive, une archive archivivante, as Sam Boursier would say, to borrow from him, could mean that its production is driven by our anger, our hopes, frustrations, our present struggles. We produce the archives that we need as a collective, but also as individuals. Our journal includes hybrid interventions and seek to challenge the monopoly of academia in the production of knowledge. It means that it's composed by visual art, poetry, fiction, situated knowledge, theories and reflections, interviews, comics, and so on. So our contributors are also activists, researchers, writers, artists, workers, sometimes students. And it's also a place for experimentation. Our autonomy allows this, but in the meantime, we cannot think about the content of our journal, like the journal as an archive, without addressing and giving visibility to its conditions of production. By conditions of production, I mean our work routines, economic model, and mode of organization, which are in fact very, very precarious. In fact, it opens up a space for some kind of DIY model. We learn to do things by taking responsibilities. We didn't receive particular training to do so. But after years of precarious work, struggling to maintain our journal, it was very difficult for our team to reappropriate a project that has been started by others and to create the conditions for transmission, especially during the pandemic. So our last issue on transmissions gave us a lot of clues to rethink our project. As editor-in-chief of ACG, I don't like this word because my role was to organize our work, our teamwork, mostly because I was a student, and I benefited from a scholarship on social criteria, so I had time to devote to this project. And thinking about our precarious conditions is important for me because it might filter the participation in our journal. Our work is also entirely benevolent, even our contributors, and it has been documented in migrant media that this precarious model might act as a social filter. It might filter our sources, but also the producers. A large part of our members were students for this reason, I guess. The format of the journal and the fact that it is printed involves selection, which is a very difficult thing to do, especially for me. And the articles they are written like within 3 months, which is not a lot, sometimes less, because it's a rush. I mean, working in ACG is a rush because we're all also involved in other political organizations, and it might have effects on the participation of our most precarious contributors. We're now thinking of creating the conditions for not being subjected to the spatial and temporal constraints because productivity requirements lead to the prediction of absences. As a racially non-mixed structure and as a Francophone intersectional journal, it would be impossible for us to benefit from state subsidies, even if we didn't really want to benefit from it. So we're kind of indebted to our generous donors, donators, and it's for the most part our families, friends, comrades. I would also add that the political conjuncture reinforces our precarious balance. Our government attacked cynically and severely anti-racist activists, then researchers working on race issues, and then also surprisingly intersectionality, associating it to Islamic terrorism and separatism. And associating also the theories we're working with as an imported threat coming from the United States. While this notion of imported concepts eludes complex circulations, we must admit that our generation of feminists and queer of color had to fill the gaps by borrowing to thoughts and practices in the United States. And it seems that we're now in a moment where it's more and more important to our generation to claim those local genealogies. It is both this joy of rediscovering or discovering that others have thought and experienced things before us, as well as a desire to understand why these stories did not reach us, that we wanted to do our last issue on transmissions. So to sum up, I would say that ACG contains the archive we want to produce, and in the meantime, it would be necessary to understand this archive as incomplete, as Paola Baqueta argued in our last issue on transmissions, but also Sam-Boursier in several interventions, not only because it reflects our needs and desires, how we think about our responsibility in a given time, but also because it exists within structures that produce absences. Giving visibility to the structures and conditions of possibility is our challenge for the year coming, because we're taking a break to rethink the project. Our contributors for the last issue developed some interesting avenues when it comes to approaching the archive or producing it. Official archives are androcentric, violent, it ignores the daily life of those who are being archived. It ignores the discrete domains of our struggles. And I think it's very important that we're gonna have to learn about Hadrat al-Weba. Masinsa is going to talk about those discrete domains. So our question was the following: how not to reproduce in our archive the same epistemic violence which is at the origin of the production of non-existence. It's a call to take responsibility for our memories. As an example, the Lux group, the Les Lesbiennes of Color, argued that our generations are co-responsible when it comes to tell our stories. Indeed, transgenerational spaces appear like a necessity for enabling such political transmissions, and the Decolonizing Sexualities Network was one of those spaces enabling such transmissions. It seems important not only because our elder sisters developed their own languages to seize their experiences, encouraging us to do so, but also because they confronted similar situations and organized around specific political actions that might extend ours. And I think it's also the case for immigrant struggle in general, because we have this same rupture in generation. This issue gave a lot of space, in fact, to lesbians of color, because they were kind of precursors when it comes to creating autonomous and anti-racist spaces in France. And we wanted to think as a collective, as a queer and trans and feminist collective, what was our responsibility in the occultation of their legacy as lesbians, but also more generally for all those that were here before us. So when I learned about the anthology of a lesbian collective called Le Groupe du 6 Novembre, and today Nao was here, she's one of the founding members of this group, called Warrior Guerrière, I became aware that having a space like Assiégé calls for our responsibility, because in France it's very difficult to be published, even in the academia. Even if the academia is getting more and more interested by queer people of color thinking, it seems that it reinforces the ignorance of our local histories, because it's most of the time about the United States and Latin America. Sometimes it depends, and I think we have to think that this kind of reinforcements, and it's quite incredible that a lot of studies about it are actually conducted from the United States, while they cannot get financed here in France. And I'm thinking about the anthology that Paola and Nao Crawford are working on, called Fireflies. And in our last issue, we talked about this. Riwa Sayer conducted an interview with both of you, and it was very interesting because we could learn a lot about how the group how they created this group, in what context, and there are a lot of similarities between our context and their context. Also, you'll find in this issue a text from Gertie Dambury, which is also an Afrofeminist coming from La Coordination des Femmes Noires, which was a group in the 70s, a group of black feminists, Afrofeminists. And she gave us a lesson, and I think that we really can think about this issue like we really can think about it like a transgenerational space, because we learned a lot from our elders. And for example, we asked Gertie to do some kind of, to pay tribute to someone, and she told us, I'm not going to pay tribute. I'm not going to pay tribute to our past struggles. I refuse to do so because it's a way to bury memories. And what I want to, what she wanted to encourage is to see the continuities and to continue the struggle. And I thought it was very, very nice to be involved in such discussions, thanks to this issue. So other articles addressed violences and conflicts within our communities, because they also constitute an obstacle to transmission, sometimes the transmission of our thinking and our practices. And it seemed that we had to find ways to repair and do justice to practice justice. But in the meantime, as Laurence Meyer argued, it's also about how we manage to find moments of joy and to create those moments of joy and of care in our communities. And it was very difficult in ICG to do so because we don't have time, we don't have money, and we don't have anything. So we're now trying to create all those conditions for enabling those political transmissions. And I'm gonna stop.
Thank you very much. So now you can go, Masinisa.
Thank you, Malek. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello, everyone. I will share my screen now. So in North Africa, there are different communities of gender and or sexual minorities with specific local cultures. These communities are all institutionally deprived of the basic right to exist due to anti-homosexuality laws inherited from French, English, and Italian colonialism. Despite these laws, these groups exist and organize themselves, developing different tools for self-protection, survival, and also to create a common culture of enjoying each other's company and reaching in the breaking cracks in the hegemonic discourse of cis heteronormative society. Among these tools, these communities have developed several languages acquired and practiced within the group. The learning and the development of these languages makes it possible to strengthen the feeling of group solidarity, to develop non-cis heteronormative semantics, and sometimes to communicate without being understood by outsiders. None of these languages has yet been studied, but you can find on the Decolonizing Sexualities Network website an introduction of the variety called Hadrat al-Luaba. I suggest now that you listen short recordings of 3 of these languages. أنا الله 11 مع شكل قد لفهش من يلاد وشبا سمشات شعلق وشلك يا العاد لسكشت على الشينا يا على وريش القحش بد مش مالدي الشالك شبيلا مش لولم لازم الشال وهاد الشينا لا عيش هاد الحجه شرط على شي مد 11 انا على الشلط باش ند مش مالدي الشالك. So here is the Hanguna spoken in Tétouan in northern Morocco too, but it is a 3-tone variety.
غنقولها تاني في نقول بها نقول العنقونه ستنقوني تخنقونه تجنقونه مين نقول من تنقول راح نقول نقد تنقول كتنقول في لهم نقولني عنقونه تنقول كان نقول نقول عنقول انت اللي نقول لي عنقونه. And here is the song Ganj spoken in Annaba in eastern Algeria. Okay. Anthropological researches already show that several North African queer cultures have particularly enriched their respective societies in the field of arts. See, for example, Mehdawi, 2008, and Van Nieuwkerk, 2010, about Egyptian queer dances. And in this covered area of creativity of these communities is the oral literacy, the songs, the proverbs, the tales, and the jokes transmitted among these groups. I propose you listen to an audio tape of a popular song within the Moroccan Lubia community.
جرا يلو بيدير جرارة كل شي عرفك مرا لابسالك سوى الحمرا وبغطيري دايرة لشوي مونديال عرفوها له بيا سبيسيال عطيها لزهو المال واللي يصير يصير اليوم سامدي سواغ لو بيا خرجة من الدار لابسة الطالون والعكار بشلخة كتير كتقول غادا الفيلا شوف كي غادو كتعواش لابسة البيرك والتازلو بيا بير.
So, in the context of the Tarihuna Huna, which means our History Here project, carried out in collaboration with the Dutch Moroccan queer feminist organization TENIT, we started thinking about how to archive the oral cultures of North African trans and queer native communities. This project is, first of all, at the initiative of members of these communities who would like to safeguard their own cultures and knowledges in a context of globalization linked to post-colonialism and the impact of Western global gay culture ensuing. We have already started collecting recordings and we met a great enthusiasm from the community's members. However, several questions remain, like how to protect the elements which are intended to remain discreet while archiving them. We are inspired for this by the experiences of certain indigenous communities around the world who made, for example, the choice that the recordings in their languages will only be accessible to the group members, their descendants, and the researchers who have actively participated in the preservation of their languages and cultures. For now, we plan to organize a discussion between the community's members and researchers to discuss the future operation, functions and goals of this North African sexual and gender minorities archive and their construction. So we hope, we hope that we will be able to present some of the first results of these discussions in the collective book project that we have with Malek. Thank you all for listening and many thanks to the organizers. We are open to all your comments, questions, and suggestions. Okay.
Thank you so much. So we'll now move on to our second panelist, Sam Boursier. Sam Boursier teaches queer and gender studies at the University of Lille. He founded the Zoo, the first queer collective in France, and he's a member of the collective archival LGBTQ+ in Paris. He's also the author of Queer Zone, the trilogy, Homo Incorporated, The Triangle, and The Farting Unicorn. And his next book on archives and archive action, Le pouls de l'archive, c'est en nous qu'il bat, should be out this year. So now, floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really thankful to the organizers. Thanks for the invitation, the organization, and everything. I'm going to talk about the way I think we do archives, archive action, living archives, archive vivante. As archive, I have a lot of new words. Maybe you won't like it, but you know. As archive actors, actresses, I wouldn't put it that way, but still, anyway, it's complicated to not to be in sexual differences, actors, actresses. So, how we do archive in the collective archive, LGBTQ+, I belong to. As you might know, the collective is struggling with Paris City Hall for more than 4 years now to open a LGBT, quote-unquote, archive center. I won't go into details regarding the struggle that started for me 20 years ago, and which is very French, so kind of very, very retarded. What I would like to do today is to talk about the archive practices we've been developing without a home, a place or a space, and not a lot of money, but still we have some. Of course, this is how the city is getting in the way of the project. They claim that they would find a place for it and give us some funding, but they don't. My talk will also be in dialogue with a talk on archives Paola Baquetas gave in 2018 for the opening on a one-day workshop and symposium the collective organized in Paris. Paola's talk proved to be very inspiring, as always, and was called Represents the Transformative Forces of the Queer of Color Archive. I will draw on many Paola's hints, and I will try to prolong them. My English is a bit broken as well, but I do it a little bit on purpose also. We have this bad habit of starting the conversation, and it happened today, about archives with Derrida and his famous book published in 1995, Mal d'archives in French, an archive fever, it's more fun, for the English translation in 1886. Archive fever is a much better title. And you mentioned it in your talk, I remember, Paola, that fever means fever as maladie, but also fever as desire for archive. There is many other Derrida. This is how I'm going to call them in my next book. If you find a better one, but I can't, go on with Derrida, Deleuze. So I found Derrida, Dédé, Foufou, and I'm going to make it like that. So there is many other Derrida's book which are stimulating for thinking and theorizing archive. And maybe we should stop referring constantly to Derrida, but still I do it. So I guess we still do, and with Foucault as well, Akafufu, or Stoller. I didn't find one for Stoller, I didn't dare, because they focus on archive and power, archive and architecture. When Derrida describes the power of the Greek archons, the 9 guys who used to rule in Athens, he's describing a will to gather, to assign a place, a mise en demeure. I don't know how to translate this, and I didn't have the time to check in the English translation. He's describing a registration through the archive. That is to say that the archontes and their successors use the archive as a technology of governmentality, that the first function of the archive is to administrate and rule, of course. This administrative use of the archive comes with the kind of archival violence we see in sexual archives and colonial archives, of course. It is also the raison d'être of the birth of national archives and professional archivists in the 19th century. The archives of the different administrations must be transferred to the state archive as public archive, and we are supposed to have an access to it, which is not true, of course, since the revolution from France, because we invented the right to access to archives, but we never do it. As shows also the recent discussion about the opening, which is not an opening, but a reclosing of the Algerian archive, etc., etc. I think we can also conceptualize archival power as a set of dissociation, separations, whose purpose is to bridle the relational and synchronous, the very much alive and embodied nature of the archive. And I think we've been talking about that. What Derrida calls a rassemblement, a gathering in the house of the archonte, a gathering or archive in an institutional place dedicated to it, is commensurate with a phase of material concentration. This phase triggers archives removals, disposition, restrictions, access codification, separation, mainly in favor of written document. But it is especially a separation from the bodies who produce the archives, or the bodies that can make them, produce them, and make them recirculate. It is also a separation by format. You don't mix objects, film, porno, dildos, papers, dresses, pillbox, and ephemera. This is something the National Archive in Paris made very clear when they jumped into the game regarding the Archive Center. It is a separation between the archive producers and the archivists who will do the inventory, the indexing, the tagging, etc. It is using, and I hope Jean is still here, it is using death as the criteria to collect people's archive. Archive is what you leave after your death. The traditional discourse on archive is a necropolitical one. It makes people associate, valorize, and care about archive alongside with so-called biological death. Sorry. The archontic principle is a principle of separation, of dissociation, and it is so precisely because the archive holds the power to gather people and bodies in a time, in a temporality which does not belong to the past, and we've been talking about that as well, but does belong to the present and the future perfect, or the future. The archive is a political and collective force. The archives and those who use them as a technology of governmentality know. Archives make it possible to do a lot of things. They generate a lot of uses and practices, and the traditional discourses about what they are or should be divert us from an archive power we can redeploy. What can be opposed to this desynchronization is a resynchronization, that is to say, to create and to animate spaces where bodies and archive producers can meet, be together, live together, do archive together, and become foyer d'archives. I don't know how to translate this. This space-time, but you can help, huh?
To translate.
It's a difficult one, I know. This space-time can be community-based archive center, be it virtual or physical, but not only. Now, if resynchronization is principle one, principle two could be the iterability of the archive. The archives iterability has to, like the American way, has to do with its production, reproduction, repetition, reactivation, and recirculation when it's done by other players rather than the traditional and institutional ones. The iteration in the sense of repetition and the itinerary in the sense of journey of the archive is ensured by minorities and their communities whose aim is to resist dislocation, to collect, to show the archive, and to make them recirculate. And we've been talking about that with ACG and everything. Actresses multiply archives loops, whereas institutional archives transform them into chains and multiply the obstacle when it comes to consult the fucking archives. It is this very iterability that is triggered by the guards of the archives, including the social sciences gatekeeper, and we could comment on that also with what everyone has been saying, you know. What is different is the political and assembling power of the archive within common temporality and common projects, the potential that comes with a non-separation of the bodies producers of archives. As Derrida was saying, quote, those who talk only about the past are the historians, right? And they think that the archives belong to them. An historian will never look at the future. That deep down, quote again, does not look at them. This is Derrida's quote. Both resynchronization and interoperability have to do as well, I won't have time to develop, with the performative scope of the archive. Its arbitrary nature. Minorities are very conscious about arbitrariness when it comes to archive, whereas professional activists would deny it and would claim still that they organize traces and remains a posteriori in a very objective way. Now, if we take into account these two principles of resynchronization and iterability, we can have a different look on the uses of the archive and rename them archives vives, archives vivantes, living archives, alive, etc. We may extend the archival domain and its functions. What are the purposes of the archives? What are they useful to? What are they useful to? Sorry. The answer is in what they produce. knowledges, and I'm not talking about sciences and academic knowledges, knowledges, politics, activism, cultures, subjectivities, identities and experiences, transformation and mutation, and pleasures. Living archives practices give rise to an extension of the archival domain. What do we have? At the top, we have the Queen, the archive history. She stands for being the natural partner of history and memory. She's very close to the archive knowledge and is subjugating function. She's close to the archive research in an academic sense with a little r. Let's not forget the archive evidence, without which the judge, the police, the state would not function and control properly. Below, we have the archive culture, the archive struggle, and the archive research with a big R. Those mean a total different relationship to the archive. The archive culture passes on and produces knowledges as well, but it has not the same function as the archive knowledge. The archive struggle is a reservoir for political struggles, and you've been talking about that again. It ensures the passing on of political and subcultural scenarios, and it allows to rely on the knowledges and the contents they have produced. Those are the archive, the collective, and the groups need to have close by in order to build and feed the struggle. And last but not least, there is the archive research with a big R, which is crucial for the building and the transformation of minoritarian subjectivities. The archive culture, the archive struggle, and the archive research with a big R are archive tools for the present and the future, for life and forms of life. The archive for the living, the archi-living. What Deleuze says about Proust in Search of Lost Time works for those very use of the archive. As important as it is, memory is nothing but a means of learning process and apprenticeship that exceeds it both through its aim and principle. The search of lost time is directed towards the future, not towards the past. Rather than sources, those archives are material for the learnings of codes, struggle, and their reproduction, adaptation, transformation. Rather than a search of the truth, the method here is encounter and contamination. Encounter with objects, documents, film, affects, emotions, and bodies. Those kind of archives place themselves outside the institutional archives regime of truth and the power and knowledge that froze us. The apprentices goes to the school of the struggle. They polish their identities, subjectivities, politics, and culture when in the archive. Living archives don't affiliate according to and you've been talking about that. I'm not going to pay the tribute what she said and the way you communicate and so living archive, yes, it's more like it doesn't affiliate according to a genealogical familialist biological paradigm. It is more a matter of contamination and mutation. As you know, and the day is the back, becoming through contamination is not a matter of representation or identity politics, but a matter of pullulation. I don't know how to translate it. Pullulate. It's a bit dirty. Pullulate. Or proliferation. Within these logics, you don't include. You just get to know the free-ass motherfucker you were talking about in your conference, the werewolf dyke, like Wingaroo, or the hairy fish turtle dyke Wittig is talking about in Virgile No, in San Francisco. I think these principles of resynchronizing, reiteration, and contamination echoes with, quote, the transformative forces of color archival materials through what Paola Bacchetta conceptualized as representing, defined as, quote, not representing, but rather as directly making present again and again archival fragments. If I got it right, but you will tell me, for Paola Bacchetta, representing goes against representing and representation in the political sense. The point is not to represent everybody or not forget a letter in the alphabetic soup. Representing goes against politics of visibility and, of course, against inclusion diversity management's model that supplants assimilation since a couple of years now. In 2018, after redefining representing, Paola Baqueta developed it as a quote, an insurgent tactic that would allow a quote to engage in a non-additive formula when it comes to whom is there and not there. She went on describing how this tactic works at three levels: the subject, events, and genre, by which she meant the genre of the archival material that would be collected. She came up with another counter-representative device, hearability. Instead of representation as representation in the liberal politic sense, that is being represented in a democracy. Hearability countered representation as well as in Darstellen figuration. By hearability, Paola Baqueta meant, I quote, a revolution in the domain of intelligibility. In this context, I find it funny, I find it revolutionary. So in this context, representing is, quote, centrally about opening up a time space for the unequivocal making present, bringing into the here now the subject, event, affects, and genre that have been excluded from the present temporal spatiality. It also, quote, involves a perpetual redefinition of what counts, I'm almost done, as archival material. Can I bring
Yes,
a bit?
of course, go ahead.
Maybe this is what we've been doing when the collective started to do oral archives and made them recirculate immediately with its podcasts. Of course, being deprived of a place where to live played a part in this. Within 3 years, we reached figures, statistics. I hate statistics, but I'm going to use it. 80,000 listeners. With 3, now 4 different series. Le feuilleton des luttes, Sous les pavés l'archive, Les nuits queer et Devenir lesbienne. I know very well that hearability is not about ears and sound, but maybe it is another kind of presence and represent that does not conflate with visibility, that conflicts with a set of identities that don't fit and will never do, especially the homonormative, white, Eurocentric, and colonial set of LGBT ideas. Should archive make us visible or alive? Present and represent? Do politics of visibility are still desirable or efficient in neoliberal society of control? Which form of visibility are we talking about when the state, the city hall, the companies, the GAFAM want to make us visible, their way or not, for the record, since they target the homo-incorporated, the productive, the reproductive, and the white one? A lot of people already answered to this question, and they said no. And I could mention a lot of people here, just Birpoir, all the critique of the QT says no, and Gossett, Stanley, and Burton in their book. For instance, tonight I would mention the work of Gossett, closed the door opened by the mainstream and switched to what they call the trapdoors that are not defined by visibility or what we already know. To go back to synchronicity, I won't go into that because it's I don't want to have time, but we might also try to do without the perverse synchronicity provided by the digital blob we feel constantly with our biodata archives. And I don't know who, yes, it's Evelyn again mentioned that, she wouldn't find, you don't find everything on the web. It's not true. And most of the time you don't know how to search or where to search or which words using, So maybe we would have to deal with that. We will see, whatever. But all those tactics aim is to make us feel that the pulse of the archive is beating in ourselves. It's all about pulse rather than dust. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Avec plaisir.
So So now our last and third panelist is Paola Baqueta, who's a professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at University of California, Berkeley. She was the first chair of the Gender Consortium at Berkeley. And among her books, it includes Commotion on Feminist and Queer Solidarities, Fatima Mernissi for Our Times, co-edited with Minu Moalem, Global Raciality, Empire, Postcoloniality and Decoloniality, co-edited with Sunaina Meira and Howard Winant, but also Gender in the Nation, Right-Wing Women. She has published over 65 articles and book chapters on transnational feminist and queer theory, decolonial theory, queer movements. She has had visiting positions at Harvard, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Université de Paris 7, and she currently has research grants with Fulbright and Andrew Wermelen. So welcome to Baqueta.
Well, I'm really happy to be on this panel because it's quite fruitful. And I want to thank the other panelists because I always learn a lot from you. I wrote this piece. It's called Assembling Didactics, Notes on Insides, Outsides of Feral Archiving, in between a discussion with folks in Morocco who are trying to do a queer archive right now. And so it's got a lot of urgency around that particular thing there. So I'd like to reflect on decolonial and queer of color archiving through a recent practice of mine of assembling the archive of the 1970s lesbian and queer anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-racism group in Philadelphia, Dyke Tactics, of which I'm a co-founding member. Some years ago, the collective unanimously elected me as its archivist, and I worked on it for years. I brought it to closure in fall 2021. The main physical archive is going to Yale University Libraries in August 2022. It was digitalized by William Way LGBTQ Center in Philadelphia in October and November of 2021, and it will be released afterwards after the Yale collection opens. So some of the items are already archived at a community-run lesbian archives in New York City, and I'll say a few words about this splitting of the archive later. But first, I'll just say a few words about Dyke Tactics. So Dyke Tactics was co-founded by a heterogeneous group of dykes in 1975 in Philadelphia on the unceded territory of the Lenape people in Turtle Island, or what colonizers call the USA. Our congealing moment was on December 4th, 1975, when we were selectively brutally beaten by Philadelphia's militarized police in a demonstration for queer rights. When we got out of the hospital, 6 of us decided to take the police to court for police brutality. And it ended up being the first case in the United States ever of queers taking police to court for police brutality. The trial was very public. It was covered on mainstream and community media. And interestingly, it does not show up in historiographies of organizing against police brutality or in LGBT movements. Dyke Tactics members included Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Filipinx, racially mixed, and white dykes of several religious backgrounds. And it encompassed dykes of many different genders, including some non-binary dykes, one trans dyke, a point that I will address in a minute. And in addition to them, there were 2 trans women who were around Dyke Tactics at that time, and one is still around the Dyke Tactics at this time. We have a Facebook group, and so we're still in touch with each other. That's what I mean by that. So today, I want to propose the notion of feral archiving to just address this process of bringing a really subaltern, subversive, partially clandestine archive into being and to engage some of the questions that it poses. The notion of feral I want to use in 2 different senses. One is feral in the sense of feral cats, because believe me, trying to get all these archival materials from our members was like herding cats. I just basically had to nearly light a fire under the asses of most of the Dyke Tactics folk to try and get them to send them materials. I went through lots of different phases with that, which I don't have time to go into, but it was quite difficult. And The point is this, that contrary to dominant archives, constructing this subaltern archive was a very long and chaotic process. And in the end, it was like herding cats. The second and related sense of feral archiving has to do with what had to be left in the wild, in the streets, unhoused, in the sense of deridada, that is the archive's residence, and by extension, outside also the designated digital space. So there are items, there are events, there are affects that remain outside forever, and this for different reasons. So in the rest of this talk, I'm just going to discuss the archive's insides, then its outside, and then some factors that bear on archival agency, intelligibility, and inventing new historiographies. The archival inside, it poses a lot of different questions. I'm going to just insist on a few here, 3 of them. And the first one is just like what actually is inside the archive for dominant institutions, that is Yale. So what became archivable? Okay, all of Didactic's collective writing, the statements, press releases, articles, tracts for demonstrations, declarations. We are fortunate that nearly everything was published in a newspaper, Hera feminist newspaper, and that some of us were, myself included, were part of the editorial committee of that newspaper. So our writing was published also widely in the press of the day, lesbian and queer press of the day. And we had also our transcript of our trial in 1976. We have the articles about our actions that were written by individual Didactics members. We have personal papers from the Didactics people. We have the poetry of some Didactics members. We have the novels of some Didactics members like Chea Villanueva with titles such as Bulletproof Dykes. And then we have some letters between Didactics members, photos of us, our actions. And we have also got a section of lesbian and queer press about us. And we have also got a section on mainstream press. So that's what's in the main archive. The second question is about that the inside poses is about physical items that could not be contained in the main archive. And they are now in a subaltern archive. So some examples are Didactics t-shirts that say Killer Dyke, a huge leather jacket that has Didactics written on in brass tacks on it. It belonged to the Bull Dyke, self-identified Bull Dyke Kathy Hogan, and a little notebook near the telephone where we used to leave messages and drawings to each other. Now, these can't be part of the official archive because Yale only archives paper and not things. So they have a home in the lesbian archives. And so it is interesting that we have to have the archive split because institutions cannot accommodate our archives, which is another reason why we need to have our own archives and be able to control them completely. So this splitting poses lots of different kinds of questions. The third question is also about assembling the out of control archive. Now, I have all this stuff that, that I had to figure out, like, what do I make some sense of it? How do I do it? I took some inspiration from Gloria Anzaldúa, not as a model to follow, but rather as an approach by which to be incited and inspired. Anzaldúa did not wait for other people to order her archive. Anzaldúa actually collected her own archive and then she ordered it in the way that she wanted, which was by project and by year. For Didactics, it's a different thing. So I created a threefold organization. That organization was around chronology, events, and the before, after, and during and aftermath for each member. Now, these are all political choices. They just sound like this is a list, but actually every single item here is about a particular political choice. The chronology is really a choice to put into relief horizontality and intertextuality among Didactics analyses, practices, and actions with other social movements with which we were deeply interconnected. So for example, we have articles on in Hera on Assata Shakur or on women in the Puerto Rican independence movement that can be correlated with didactics solidarity actions or statements on those issues. The chronology also undoes the dominant reductive interpretations of didactics as solely about the 1976 trial, I mean, it can be fixated on that otherwise. And so we wanted to demonstrate other actions. So for example, we have other actions chronologically, like a call for women's labor strike, which correlates to some labor movements, lesbian graffiti, Zaps calling on lesbians to engage in armed struggle at a time when liberation movements are engaging in armed struggle, disruptions of colonial biennial celebrations that were happening in Philadelphia. We did street theater that was also related to the disruption of the biennial and correlates also to Native American movements, and also work against the snuff films, which were being aired all over the place. The second way of organizing it was through events folders. So they compile many different kinds of items around an event. They exemplify temporal linearity that is so thick that it's no longer anything linear. For example, the Didactics Trial folder begins on December 4th, 1975. It spans the next 2 years, but it includes a whole lot of different things, like, for example, our statements, first of all, but also articles in the press that were really, you have to imagine what it was like to be in the press then. Like, you hear these queer, crazy queers, in the press. Mainstream press, queer press around our trial. And the trial transcripts that we got, and a song that we wrote and sang at the trial, photos of us, with shaved heads and things like that. So the third category was folders for members. And this is a subject-centric part of the archive, but it helps to unfix didactics historically. It helps to de-essentialize and de-exceptionalize the archive and the collective. It makes apparent that various members were active in other kinds of movements at the same time, and that we brought those analyses from the other movements into didactics and vice versa. So together, these three kinds of folders expose the 1970s differently. They highlight a broad network of decolonial, anti-capitalist, anti-racism, lesbian and queer groups, of which didactics was a part. And they provide materials for decolonial and queer of color history and continuity. But let's turn to outside the archive, because a whole lot has to be, a whole lot is unhoused, undomesticated, it remains in the street. So the outside, I'm going to address four kinds of outsides here. One is the traceless outside, then the willfully outside, then the uninscribable outside, and then the unknown outside. So the traceless outside, all right. Of the Didactics archive, it includes like lost actions, events, inscriptions, affects, interrelationality, states of being. An example, a very concrete example, is that we used to write blood in our blood on bathroom walls. That is, in a body positive mood, move in our collective home, we would write poetry in menstrual blood. Whoever was menstruating, not everybody did menstruate, by the way, but whoever did was write the blood poems, and they would remain for everybody to read them. And then, because they were on the tiles, they would get washed. It would get washed away. Well, we don't have a single photo of that, so it's gone. There's also the willful outside. It's about what people do not want to have archived. So for example, sometimes we lacked sufficient funds for rent. And so a sex worker among us went out and brought in the needed funds. And she has since developed a budding career which requires forms of respectability, and that they preclude being out as a former sex worker. So we have lost an important part of history, important part of our history of the labor that actually helped to sustain our home, our life, our politics. And I can't elaborate on that because I have no permission to do so. Then we have the uninscribable outside. It includes items that we can't even ever archive, even if we wish. So an example is healing music. It never had a materiality, and it was music that we invented when we jammed together. We were convinced that we could heal each other with music and with tones and with all this. And so that's also lost. Another unknown outside is, the last one is unknown outside, and it's twofold. It includes what elsewhere I have called, through a reading of Antonio Gramsci, by the way, the and another, or the knowable unknown. And it also encompasses, there's on the one hand, the knowable unknown, we can know it someday. And then on the other hand, there's the X, which I call the X, which is through a reading of Borges, but we don't need to know that. But it is about what we don't even imagine to be there. So there are two kinds of unknowns. One is an unknown that eventually can be known. The other is an unknown that we will never know because we don't even imagine it. So these items inside and outside the archive are in tension, such that the archive is never complete. And so in some work that I've done on archives in France, I've elaborated this relationship of incompleteness through the notion of the almost archive. Now, I have to say a few words about the inside out of the almost archive. First of all, I want to address didactic's relation to power, which is both inside and outside, by the way, its agency, epistemic and interpretive questions, and some kind of new historiographies for the present and future. The inside and the outside are saturated in relations of power that get reproduced continually, in the sense of Foucault, and it's affected by selective premature death, social death, and death-bound conditions. We see power operating in who among us in didactics has died prematurely, who is disabled, who is in a nursing home. We see how class at birth and acquired class privilege affect who writes, who feels at ease with sending materials, who does not. And in some, despite all the compensatory efforts, conditions of power bear on what ends up inside or outside the archive. Another dimension is the archive's agency. The didactics archive actively interrupts the tranquility of dominant historiographies of feminist, queer, trans movements, and of people's movements for liberation from colonialism, occupation, and capitalism. It disrupts the whitewashing and the homogenizing turfification of 1970s lesbian movements. Fortunately, there are some new histories that are coming into existence, and although I don't have time to talk about that. Finally, the almost archive has epistemic, interpretive limitations. It cannot speak for itself. It's open to all kinds of interpretation, and it's subjected to what Jin Haritaworn and et al. Call murderous inclusion, or forms of assimilation in a dominant archive that neutralize its radicalness by reframing and resignifying it. So I have to admit that, I put this archive together, and the whole time I was very nervous, and I'm actually really nervous about its release, because this almost archive, when it gets into the world, it's going to be open to so much distortion, and that distortion is like about my life. So I'm very nervous about it. To conclude, I want to suggest two brief points. The first is a word of caution about new historiographies. People who are writing historiographies based on archives need to work very hard, I think, to accurately interpret archival items, because what seems clear may be extremely far from clear. So, for example, the pronoun she in the 1970s for decolonial, dyke of color, and radical dyke allies that we find in statements, in tracts, in slogans, in performances, in art, for some collectives, including ours, you would have to know that at the time, she encompasses many genders, many self-identifications. It's lesbian, queer, butch dyke, queen, bull dyke, non-binary, androgynous, andro, trans, tyke dyke, or two or more of these kinds of things at once. So she could also include unspeakable genders beyond pronounable genders. And one, I think that Sam just referred to free ass motherfucker, which is Janelle Monáe's self-identification of the gender identification. So, and sexuality identification. That's an example. But anyway, the second point is that because there are so many feralities and many kinds of outsides, many kinds of unknowns that are integral to the archives, that if we are using them to write histories, then we would have to keep some spaces open for both knowable unknowns and unknowable unknowns. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panelists for these generative conversations, very inspiring conversations, which are both inspiring and productive in tension. The tension resides in practices of archiving, erasures prevalent in archiving practices, as Malik and Massinissa termed them, the androcentric nature of archives. The production of archives in Assiégé, Didactics, and others reference the critique, but also go beyond these critiques. And that is where it becomes interesting to organize into producing queer and trans of color archive. Now, this archive comprises, as in the outstanding research of Massinissa, sexual and gender minority languages in North Africa. The import of such constructive work is, of course, manifold, not the least being problematizing the absences in archiving practices. There's another way to think of archives is about intergenerational crossing that you were pointing to, Malik, the transfer of mobilization, and more significantly, for me at least, the memory of struggle that Malik so rightly pointed to. It is about co-writing history together. Sam's research places the cursor in the present with the principle of the archive vivante, especially with the thorny issue, I'm not going into that, of the LGBTQ Archive Center in Paris. The talk about absences extending on Massinissa and Malik's interventions articulated the power attached to archives and how archives are deployed to dissociate from the living archive, as you were saying, Sam, the exclusion of the oral as archive. This separation, and I like the idea of separation as well, the separation of objects, of writing, of and other archives that archival practices make, what constitutes archives and their legitimacy. So Sam signaling to the itinerary of the archive, the trajectory of the archive, connects to Paula's intervention on the processes of assembling, of organizing archives. Paula's presentation underscored the praxis of archiving, what she terms as feral archiving, that is to say, what the feel of the archive is, its insides and outside of the archives as body, as the example of Didactics demonstrates. Feral archiving, as she insists, has two different meanings, two different senses. So one is about feral cats and herding the cats, as Paula says, and the second related meaning has to do with what has been left outside, including outside the digital space. The praxis of archiving is also about assembling the out of control, the unhoused archive. The insides and outsides of archives are implicated in relations of power. However, as the example of Didactics shows, archives can also be disruptive of the dominant. So overall, the three talks transact around the notion of the intelligibility of archives, of queer and trans archive, of the minoritarian archive and archiving. So that's my takeaway from these three talks, but I'm sure you have more. And if you have questions.
If you have any questions, the floor is yours.
My first question is more of a reaction to Massinissa Garen's presentation. I was curious about the process of archiving or even making accessible languages that are meant to not be understood by non-members of the LGBT community in North Africa. And the second question is to Malik Sheikh. You mentioned transgenerational spaces, and I was wondering if you had to archive immaterial concepts or such as the transgenerational shame, and how do you deal with it? Because I know it's very present in North African communities and or families. Thank you.
Marcelisa, can you come in?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay.
Did you?
Yeah, I heard it. Okay. Thank you for your question. Actually, it's a very it's a big challenge, and it's something very important in that work, that there is secrecy about these languages. It's a point about these languages, but it is not all about them. It's these languages are not used only to don't be understood by outsiders. They are, first of all, for what I understood for now and for what I know about these languages, is they are used to make community. You cannot use these languages outside. It's very hard to use them outside because you will be recognized as a queer or a trans person, because they are in the places where they are spoken. People know about these languages, and they know that if someone speaks that way, it means that this person is a queer or a trans person or a sex worker. So it's not that much about secrecy, but about community, solidarity. And so because of this, we think that it is possible to do that work, to archive them. But in the same way, also, we have to think about the secrecy, to keep the secrecy. For example, on the article that I published on the sorry, I just yes, Decolonizing Sexualities Network website. Okay, there is I kept from this public article the words that the members of the community told me that we need to keep secret. And the words that I put on the article and the glossary are not do not get that very important secrecy. So it is not everything about secrecy. But about the archive, we are thinking actually about how can we keep the archive private. But actually, this is a very big question and a big challenge about the way we can keep it private and in non-mixity. And I don't know how to say this. So yeah, so thank you for your question. Actually, this is something we are thinking a lot about. And we do not have an answer for now, but we plan, as I told you, we plan to do a discussion between the members of these communities to think about the way we can do this. We can keep the secrecy of the languages who need secrecy, and yeah, on the archive. Thank you. I hope that I answered to you.
Okay, so I hope I remember the question. I think you were talking about immaterial concepts and transgenerational shame. So I just wanted to react also about what Massinissa told, because I think that the reason why we're working on this book project and also having those practices, it's also linked to the fact that we are produced as non-existent, and it was very frustrating for us to have like this global frame, like this global homonationalism, which naturalizes our absences and in the meantime critiques of homonationalism, who reproduce this kind of this same naturalization. And working on Hadrat al-Weba, working with Moroccan activists like Aida Khairuddin, who actually intervened in ACG, it was very important for us to like keep traces from all those discussions and so on, because it was becoming very difficult to when they say that you don't exist and so on. Like even in France, anti-racism, it's the main discourse they draw on this kind of idea that in North Africa you have how do you say homoeroticism? Yeah, homoeroticism, and that's it. And I think that it's a wrong lecture, because not everyone who's engaged in sexual practices like homosexual practices is considered as homosexual or as deviant in North Africa. So for us, it's also very important, and I think it's difficult because the question Masnisa is asking is very difficult to answer, because we have the choice between not, I mean, how do we keep our secrets? How do we keep our secrets? But in the meantime, how do we do to not, to resist those kind of naturalization? And to answer your question about affects and shame, I think we didn't really work. We didn't really work on this particular affect. I guess we didn't really work. Yeah, I don't think we had discussions. I don't know. Maybe Massinissa knows, because he was he used to write for ACG in 2015 and so on. But we didn't really work. Like, it's not an affect that I would say defines our way of being, I guess. And I think it's maybe Massinissa has something to say about it, but I don't have an answer about it. But maybe I didn't understand your question. You did. I did.
I meant we were talking about ancestors and elders, and maybe about the process of archiving. And I guess my question came from maybe the difficulty one can have with having a discussion without taboo with elders about sexuality or even homosexuality, lesbianism, etc.
Oh, okay. I think it's interesting because it points to the notion of visibility, and in ACG we try to create politics to not, because we don't think that everyone has to be visible or to say, like sometimes we disidentify. Sometimes I mean I'm here now because I'm having this politics of solidarity, but even with Massinissa we don't always use the notion queer. In Algeria it doesn't mean anything, and I guess it's contextual, it's conjunctural, and yeah, we just try to create the conditions for not forcing people to out themselves, and even us, we don't say everything about our lives and so on, and for us it's very important to let people, I mean, yeah, to let them decide what they want to share about themselves or not, and we don't force them to come out or anything like this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I guess I hadn't really thought about my question, but I will do that using it.
It's okay.
Do you want to add to that, Massinissa?
No, it's fine. Thank you, Malek. Thank you. Thank you all.
I would like to hear more about the question of visibility and secrecy, and in a way respect, and how we can work with and around all those criteria. I always think about as someone that works with archives of cisgender women. I always think of the discussion, the very big discussion that exists around the history of women and how they hide or they do not archive their lives or their works, etc. And I always compare that with an expression that we have in Brazil that says sombra y agua fresca, shadow and fresh water, which is something that we seek, that we love, to have shadow and fresh water. And so every time that I hear, oh, someone is in the shadow, someone is obscured in history, I always compare that in a way in my head as a way to think that there were some agentivity also in this shadowing. I don't know if I'm not at all clear, but I would like to hear more about what do you guys think about the obligation of visibility or the weight of invisibility as well.
But I've said, why politics of visibility became a dead end right now, also because it fits with politics of identity in such a way. It's a general context also. You see, for instance, the city hall. I mean, when we started the project, not the same project, but we started with, the need, the desire to have an archive center like 20 years ago. Actually, it was not us, because I was just like, I was bringing the project and I left. At the time, I mean, the mayor was, it's also interesting to see how the left doesn't want it, how much the left is against the fact that it's not only about writing history or making people who are invisible visible, because we've been, and we always been made very visible since the 19th century. I'm talking about the Eurocentric context. So, and Foucault said that, it's a fufu. Was saying that, it's about archiving silences, he was writing history of sexuality and everything. So, and he came up with this thing, productive censorship. I mean, you are made visible and you are made invisible. It's always, So, for instance, when it started and when the city of it was run by Decolonial, a socialist, a gay guy who did a little coming out. He didn't want to be visible at all because he was running for the city, and he did a little coming out. I'm here on TV. It's not me. I'm not gay. I'm gay. I'm gay. And then we were very much in a very universalist still we are, but it was much more coming from them like being anti-communitarian, anti-communautaire. At the time we were the communitarian. Now it's it's other people, right? And now we are and so, but they didn't want, they didn't want us in a way. Now, I mean, 20 years later, I mean, the woman who was being, I mean, the Dauphine, I don't know the word for it, I mean, Anne Hidalgo was brought by the guy who did the little coming out. And now they want us and they don't want it. They want to make us visible, but they don't want us to be visible. They don't want us to be, in autodetermination, which is, come on, it's the basics for the left. But they're not the left. We know from 1983 that they began to do the neoliberal shit, the social democratic and everything. So I would say it's a balance. So it's always a two ways. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but in the sense that, what I would say is that we are especially here, especially in let's say the Eurocentric epistemology, we're very much focusing on the eye and visuality and the way we cut the body also. So I would say, of course, there's a lot of things and a lot of lives and a lot that have been lost, that. Then I don't know, what historians do with that and what we can do with it. But I would say, why don't we focus on, other senses also? And for instance, I don't want to talk about them because they're not here, but in the sex worker archives, I mean, most of them don't want to be visible or can't be visible. But at the same time, we can, Paula, when you was not about making things visible or invisible with your files and your folders and everything, the way you assemble. But it's always another assemblage each time, I would say that. So, getting with the sound, and at the same time, I mean, okay, we can invent, like, not rules, but ways of making things available and not available. And this is, I don't want to talk much longer, but,
Yeah, to me, the question of visibility is really tied up with the question of intelligibility. Visible to who and how? Who can decode and who cannot decode? So we've always had queer under the radar decoding that is not necessarily visible to dominant communities, but we have the notions of gaydar and all that have to do with you can figure out if somebody's queer or not, kind of. This is in the global north, but then I think the question of visibility, it is very contextual also. It's about intelligibility, but also very much contextual, because what looks like visibility here may not look like visibility somewhere else. I lived for a very long time in India where, two women living together was not ever imagined to be, up until the queer movement came, it was not imagined that they were partners. And I knew lots of partners who were living together and they were passing as, they're social workers, single women, that category. And so, whereas if they were living in New York, they would be two dykes, and that's it. You see, so it is. It's very much a contextual kind of a thing, I think, and both one of intelligibility and of contextuality. But like in the global north, visibility, we are then cathected into all kinds of really dubious projects, of what Jin Hooded, the one has called, murderous inclusion. I think that that's the next step to being to that kind of visibility. And on the other hand, I also want to respect that there are queers who cannot be non-visible because their genders and their sexualities are such that they are not going to ever pass for invisible in in the global north. That is how it is. So I also think that visibility for me is a big, like, I feel it like we're super constraining. You have to correspond to a certain kind of image in order to be visible in a particular way. And also there are now with pronouns, I was just hanging around a whole bunch of people, all of whom identify as they, but have very different relations to visibility and invisibility and to cis, what passes for cis in the context in which they are. So I think, it's a great question. I think we just need to think about it more. I would think about it deeply contextually. I would think about how it gets recuperated, and I would think about what is and is not intelligible under the rubric of visibility.
I think what happens with visibility is, of course, this overarching signifier that we have in the global north of coming out. There's a routine narrative of coming out, whereas coming out can actually result in death or at least family violence in several countries in the global south. And I think Massinissa was talking about that these are laws inherited from the French colonization, which are still prevalent in Algeria. So I think we have to be very careful about the dose of visibility and what it means to particular peoples as well. But I do think there is a question there.
Yeah,
Julie, did you want to? Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to piggyback on this conversation, the question is directed to both Sam and Paula. Both of you spoke about what the control of archives. I was wondering if there's a way, have you visioned this at all? Like, what might that look like? Like, what are the biggest hurdles to an autonomous archive? Are they economic? What would it take for the objects that are non-paper to be together in didactics with your paper objects? Because both of you, like Paula, for example, she spoke about the importance of controlling your own archives in relationship to the non-paper objects that Yale University would not take because they only archive paper. Is that correct? Yes. Which to me is like, you know, that type of splittage in the archive is massive. So I was wondering what would it take to control the archive on your own completely, to control the archives? What are the biggest burdens? Economic, I imagine. But yeah, I was wondering if it's too big of a question to what might that look like if you were able to control it?
It's really a great question. I think you know, I was faced with this archive, like where to put it, you know, and your question really hits home at that level, because on the one hand, I thought it might be nice to put it in the lesbian archives in New York, but they're very, I think they're really very white archives, and they're opening up now. But moreover, it's run by volunteer labor, and from time to time, in order to pay the rent or, you know, pay for whatever needs to be paid for, they will sell some archival items. And so I was horrified by the idea that, you know, like the didactics, Kathy's Bulldike jacket with a brass tacks might be, you know, sold to like the highest bidder, and who knows who's going to be able to walk around wearing it. I mean, that just totally freaked me out. And so I decided, and also our papers, how do you preserve them? So financially, finances are a huge problem. You know, when you have papers that are 30, 40 years old, you have to have some way to preserve them. They can just disintegrate. And so there is not a single archive that I know of that's a community archive that has the capacity to house all of these things and also to preserve them properly. So therefore, you know, we had to split the archive, but it's also not a solution. And the splitting of the archive, of course, in the main archive, you can have photos. Here's the jacket that's not in the archive, that kind of thing, but it's not the same. So I think financially, we are not in a place where we can control our archives, and that's very disturbing. That we need to be in a place where we control our own archives. And also where the collectives who are archived have a chance to archive their own collective. This is really, I find it extremely annoying to have somebody who has no clue what's going on to just impose an order on an archive. That to me is like, are you crazy? That's not happening. So our archive, you know, is ordered in a particular way that is part of political choice. But otherwise, if you don't archive it, like Yale was like, oh, you mean you have already ordered it? That's great, because they were going to order it. And I was like, no, you were not going to order it. We are ordering it. So, and they were fine with that. They've been wonderful, by the way. I have to say that they have just been extremely good about everything. So I'm really happy that we're putting it there. But it's expensive to house, and in fact, you know, speaking of Berkeley did not have the finances to house the didactics archive, or did not have it as a priority. I don't know. We have a couple of Berkeley folk here, and you know, it's gone to Yale because of that.
Sam,
yeah, you're describing the ideal thing. Basically, is why we're having so much trouble here in Paris. Not that Paris is the center of France, because there is collective doing wonderful stuff in Lyon and in Marseille. And in Marseille, they have a place, so it's a whole different story. And the context here in France is very different from the States, because in the States, you have a market for archives, especially in universities. They buy, and there's people who come to France actually, and they go back to the States and they sell it again. There is a little bit of money ticket there for different reasons, also because of partner of American, but still. So here we made it like a public service, and we said that we are going to do it. So we need the money, we need the public funding, and we know for very good and bad reasons, and it's a ongoing discussion in the collective, that it's possible to have private money on this kind of a project, also, because of this records of inclusivity and stuff.
It is possible, or it's not?
It's possible. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, in terms of when you want to do digital stuff, and I'm not only talking about, digitalizing stuff, but also doing digital design, having, for instance, the digital center we're planning to open is not a copy of the physical place. It's a whole different story. So it's a lot of money, it's a lot of things, and also, I mean, if you want to make your archive living, you have to tag them, somebody has to do it, it has to be the people who knows, etc., etc., etc. So maybe that's why we're having this fight also, because they don't want to give us this power, and we had a huge fight with the National Archive. We did already something with the object, ACT UP, for instance. They had to move from their place because they didn't have the money, and Fabergé was not financing anymore the place. So they decided to keep some archive for the work, for the struggle, for the expertise also on treatment and everything. And then they gave something to the National Archive, the French one, the best one. What they did is we don't want the object. At the time, there was a museum of anthropologists, a couple of anthropologists, sometimes they did. They were affiliated with a museum in Paris, a very wonderful Musée des Arts et des Traditions Populaires. So all the objects, let's say a box pill, for the treatment, or dress, or the corn, what you use when you want to do an action with the next noise, what is it? The corn de brume. How do you translate?
What?
The corn de brume.
I have no idea what that is.
The object went to this place, then they moved to Marseille, to the museum. So it's split. But to give you another example, for instance, the National Archive, focusing on noble archive, or ACT UP as a social movement, which is totally different. For instance, when you have a book check, we don't do that anymore, but they used to have one, and you have some where you can see that, ACT UP bought a fake blood on actions against the social story, or to spill out the blood or on someone. So they would throw it away. So, and there is autonomous archive. If the lesbian archive in Paris, for instance, so yes. in Bologna, they have a little group trying to do archives, and people are more and more doing it. But then, if you don't have the money to try, if you don't have the money to make them alive, if you don't have the time or the money and the people, that's why we're asking, like a lot of money, and having like 2 or 3 or 4 and then 6, people who are hired on a regular basis. And so, so you have, this is, so we decided to make it also because, we thought we could take advantage of Paris and the competition. Because, so basically, we're playing with the pinkwashing, we're asking the money from the pinkwashing. But in Paris, they want to do pinkwashing without money. This is the problem. But so, it depends how you decide. But then in the States, more of a cultural space, a learning center where people can produce and do the archive. And also the oral archive. Because if we manage to open, we would have, like, for instance, the sex workers archives would be tagged. So imagine someone is coming, it doesn't have to be an academic or what, and we want he or she or they or them or to have a look at when they enter the place, they have fun objects, they have oral stories, they have everything. And it's a different way of getting it, because, you know, the historians, the people who think archive of the property, or the social scientists who do like tons of field work, and they freeze the history, the talks and the conversation. I mean, also we would have to manage to brought up a different culture about reactivation of these fields. And basically, we should not call them a field anymore, because it's a military, whatever, metaphor. It should be archived. And then if a social scientist goes to someone, maybe they should reframe their field as archive. What are you doing? So the archive paradigm is, you know, substituting from the field work, for instance. So it's a totally different story and a different way of producing knowledges, not field or discipline or feeding the discipline, because then you have the sociologists, you have the politics, the data, they're on the side of data, the sociologists are on the side of field, and the historian, of course. Archives are their thing. It's not true. We have to change that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for your answer. We'll have to end the collective conversation here, and which can be continued on an individual level at the cocktail, which is given after. But thanks everyone.